The security guard's flashlight beam cuts through the darkness of the abandoned Thurmond coal mine, illuminating rusted equipment that hasn't moved in 90 years. But tonight, something is different. The air vibrates with a low mechanical hum that shouldn't exist, and from deep within the sealed shaft, 17 helmet lights flicker to life, moving in perfect formation toward the surface, just like they did on the night of the cave-in, when 17 men never came home. Your hands go cold as you realize those lights are getting closer, the grinding of pickaxes against stone growing louder with each passing second. And suddenly you understand why the locals won't come here after dark. Because what died in these mountains doesn't stay buried. This is Verified Souls, and tonight we're taking you into the forgotten hollows of Appalachia, where 13 towns hold secrets that were never meant to see daylight. Hit that subscribe button right now, because once you hear these stories, you'll understand why some places are left off the map for a reason. And you'll want to be part of our family when we uncover the darkness that lurks in America's most isolated communities. Thurmond wasn't supposed to exist anymore, not really. Not in any meaningful way that mattered to the world beyond the mountains. The coal had run out decades ago, the company had packed up and left, and the people had scattered like leaves in a wind that never stopped blowing through those West Virginia hollows. What remained was a skeleton of a town, a few dilapidated structures clinging to the hillside like the last teeth in an old man's mouth, and a railroad track that still saw the occasional freight train rumble through in the dead of night. But Andre didn't care about any of that history when he took the security job watching over the remaining company property. He needed the money, plain and simple, and sitting alone in a guard shack for 12-hour night shifts seemed like easy work compared to the construction gigs that had dried up over the winter. The site supervisor, a leathery old man named Manuel, who looked like he'd been carved from the same coal seams he'd spent his life working, had given Andre a simple set of instructions during his first day. Patrol the perimeter every 2 hours, keep the vandals out, and under no circumstances should he approach Mineshaft 7 if he heard anything coming from that direction. Andre had laughed at that last part, assuming it was some kind of hazing ritual for the new guy, but Manuel's expression had remained stone serious, his eyes carrying a weight that suggested he'd seen things that kept him awake long after his shifts had ended. The first 3 nights passed without incident. Just Andre, his thermos of coffee, and the oppressive silence of the mountains pressing in from all sides. He'd walk his patrol route with his flashlight cutting through the darkness, seeing nothing but rusted equipment and buildings that looked ready to collapse if you breathed on them too hard. But on the 4th night, everything changed in a way that would make Andre question whether some places should ever be left alone with their ghosts. It started at 2:17 in the morning, according to his phone, which was the only thing that seemed to work reliably in this dead zone where cell service came and went, like a ghost itself. Andre was halfway through his patrol, walking past the old processing plant where they used to sort the coal by grade when he heard the first sound. It was faint at first, so subtle that he almost convinced himself it was just the wind playing tricks in the hollow spaces of abandoned buildings. But then it came again, clearer this time, unmistakable in its rhythm and purpose. The sound of metal striking stone, that distinctive clang of a pickaxe biting into rock, echoing up from somewhere beneath his feet. Andre stopped walking, his breath forming clouds in the frigid mountain air, and listened. The sound continued, not just one pickaxe, but multiple tools working in unison. The kind of synchronized rhythm that only came from experienced miners who'd spent years working side by side in the darkness. He pulled out his flashlight and swept it across the area, searching for the source. But there was nothing there except the sealed entrance to Mineshaft 7 about 50 yards to his left. The concrete barrier that blocked the entrance looked solid and undisturbed, covered in decades of grime and graffiti from kids who'd been brave enough to venture this far into the abandoned complex. The pickaxe sounds grew louder, more insistent, and Andre felt his heart rate accelerate as he realized the sounds were coming from behind that sealed entrance, from deep within a mine shaft that hadn't been operational since 1932. Andre thought about Manuel's warning, about the old man's serious expression, and the way his hands had trembled slightly when he'd pointed toward Mine Shaft 7 during the orientation. He thought about turning around, heading back to the guard shack, and pretending he'd heard nothing at all. But curiosity has always been humanity's fatal flaw, and Andre was no exception to that ancient weakness. He approached the sealed entrance slowly, his flashlight beam dancing across the concrete barrier. And that's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were wet boot prints on the ground in front of the seal, the kind of prints that coal miners' boots would make. Except these prints were leading out from the barrier, from the solid concrete, as though someone had walked straight through the wall and continued on into the night. The prints glistened in his flashlight beam, and when Andre knelt down to touch one, his fingers came away black with coal dust and something else. Something wet and thick that he didn't want to identify. The pickaxe sound suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been, a pregnant quiet that felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then he heard the voices, muffled and distant but unmistakably human, calling to each other in the practiced shorthand of men who worked in the dark places of the earth. They were speaking about a cave-in, about being trapped, about the air running out, and their voices carried a desperation that transcended time itself. Fernando had been the foreman of Mineshaft 7 in 1932, according to the plaque that Andre had seen near the company office, and 17 men had died under his supervision when the shaft collapsed during a routine excavation. The official report had called it an unavoidable accident, an act of God or nature that no amount of precaution could have prevented. But Andre had done some research during his first few days on the job, bored and curious about the place where he'd be spending his nights, and he'd found newspaper archives that told a different story. Local reporters had questioned the company's safety standards, had interviewed family members who insisted their husbands and fathers had complained about dangerous conditions, about shortcuts being taken to meet production quotas, about warning signs being ignored. An investigation had been promised, but it never materialized, buried under political pressure and economic realities of a Depression-era coal town that couldn't afford to lose its primary employer. The 17 men had been sealed in that shaft, and the company had moved operations to a different location, and Thurmond had continued to exist for another few decades before finally giving up the ghost entirely. Now Andre stood in front of that sealed tomb, listening to voices that shouldn't exist, watching as points of light began to appear in the darkness beyond the concrete barrier. The lights were small and focused, like the carbide lamps that miners used to wear on their helmets, and there were 17 of them, Andre counted without meaning to, 17 lights swaying in unison, as though attached to men who were walking toward the surface. He could see them through the concrete somehow, or maybe the concrete had become translucent, or maybe his mind was simply showing him what his eyes couldn't possibly be seeing. The lights moved with purpose and coordination, rising through the collapsed shaft, navigating around obstacles that no longer existed, or perhaps had never been cleared away. Andre wanted to run, every instinct in his body screaming at him to get away from this place, but his legs wouldn't cooperate, rooted to the ground by a combination of fear and horrified fascination. The voices grew louder, and he could make out individual words now, could hear a man calling for Coulson to check the support beams, could hear another voice, deeper and rougher, belonging to someone named Reese, saying that something didn't feel right about this section of the shaft. These weren't residual haunts, weren't just echoes of the past playing on a loop. These were men trapped in their final moments, reliving their deaths night after night, and they were getting closer to the surface with each passing second. The concrete barrier began to vibrate, dust falling from its surface in small cascades, and Andre finally found the strength to move. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the abandoned rail tracks that ran past the mine entrance, his flashlight beam wild and unfocused as panic took over. The pickaxe sounds resumed, but now they were hitting the barrier from the inside, systematic and determined, the sound of men trying to dig their way out of a tomb that had held them for nearly a century. Andre ran, his boots pounding against the packed earth, his breath coming in ragged gasps that burned his lungs in the cold mountain air. Behind him, he heard the sound of concrete cracking, the groan of stressed material finally giving way, and then the most horrible sound of all, the screech of the metal door that shouldn't exist being dragged open from the inside. He didn't look back, couldn't bring himself to see what was emerging from Mineshaft 7, but he could feel their presence behind him, could sense. 17 pairs of eyes watching him flee could almost hear the question they were asking without words. Why did you leave us down there? Why didn't anyone come? Andre made it back to the guard shack and locked himself inside, his hand shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get his key in the door. He called Manuel, not caring that it was 3 in the morning, and the old man answered on the first ring as though he'd been waiting for this call. Manuel listened to Andre's breathless account without interruption, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that came from years of carrying this knowledge. Every year on March 15th, Manuel explained, the anniversary of the cave-in, the miners of Shaft 7 tried to dig their way out. Every security guard who'd worked this job had heard them, and most had quit after that first encounter. But a few stayed because the pay was good, and because someone needed to bear witness to what had been done to those men. The company had known the shaft was unstable, Manuel said, had received warnings from multiple engineers, but production quotas mattered more than miners' lives in 1932, and 17 men had paid the price for that calculation. Their bodies were still down there, Manuel continued, sealed behind tons of collapsed rock and concrete, never properly recovered, never given the funerals they deserved. The company had paid off the families and moved on, and Thurmond had slowly died, and those 17 miners had been left in the dark to dig and dig and dig, forever trying to reach a surface they would never see again. Andre quit the next morning, and Manuel didn't try to talk him out of it, just handed him his final paycheck and offered a piece of advice. Never take a job that requires you to guard something that should have been dealt with honestly from the start. Some places carry their sins in ways that refuse to be forgotten, and Thurmond was one of them, a town that had traded men's lives for coal and profit, and now existed only as a monument to that transaction. The mine entrance was sealed again when Andre drove past it one final time, the concrete barrier showing no signs of the cracks he'd heard forming, no evidence of the door that had been dragged open. But he knew it would happen again next year, and the year after that, and for as long as those 17 men remained unrecovered and unavenged. Some debts can never be fully paid, and some shifts never truly end, and in the hollow darkness of Appalachia's forgotten places, the dead keep working, still hoping that someone, someday, will finally bring them home. The photographs were what drew Helena to Zenith in the first place. Black and white images she discovered in a box of her grandmother's belongings after the funeral. Pictures of a place that shouldn't exist anymore but somehow still did, frozen in time like an insect preserved in amber. Her grandmother had never mentioned Zenith during all those Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, had never spoken about the 6 months she'd apparently lived there in 1966 before moving to Louisville and never looking back. But the photos told a story her grandmother had refused to share, images of a bustling coal camp with neat rows of company houses, children playing in dusty streets, men with lunch pails heading toward the mine entrance in the pre-dawn darkness. What made Helena's skin crawl was the date written on the back of the last photograph in the sequence November 15th, 1967, and the caption scrawled in her grandmother's handwriting, 2 weeks before God turned his face away. Helena was a freelance journalist who specialized in forgotten American communities, the kind of places that fell off maps and out of memory, And Zenith represented exactly the type of mystery that had built her modest reputation. She'd done her research before making the drive into eastern Kentucky, had combed through newspaper archives and county records, and what she'd found was a story that made no sense according to any rational explanation. On November 29th, 1967, every single resident of Zenith vanished between the hours of sunset and sunrise. 203 people gone without a trace, leaving behind a ghost town that looked like its inhabitants had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The drive into Zenith took Helena down roads that seemed to resist her presence, winding mountain passages that her GPS couldn't track properly, the signal cutting in and out until finally giving up entirely and leaving her with nothing but a blue dot spinning aimlessly on a blank screen. She passed through other small communities on the way, places that were barely hanging on with their boarded-up storefronts and churches that looked like they held more ghosts than congregation members. And at each stop where she asked for directions, the response was always the same. Faces would go carefully blank when she mentioned Zenith, and people would suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be, but not before she caught the fear in their eyes, that particular kind of dread that comes from knowing something terrible and having the good sense to keep your mouth shut about it. Only one person had been willing to talk, an old man sitting outside a gas station in a town called Wayland, his face weathered like cracked leather, and his eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen things that defied explanation. He'd told Helena that nobody from the surrounding communities went to Zenith anymore. Hadn't for decades, not since the National Guard had cordoned off the area in the weeks after the vanishing and then quietly withdrawn, leaving no official explanation and no follow-up investigation that anyone could find records of. The old man had leaned in close, his breath smelling of tobacco and something sour, and told her that time didn't work right in Zenith, that shadows moved independent of any light source, and that compasses spun like pinwheels once you crossed into what used to be the town limits. Helena had thanked him for the warning, paid for her gas, and continued driving, because journalists don't build careers by turning back when things get strange. She found Zenith just as the sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains, that golden hour light painting everything in shades of amber and blood orange, and her first impression was how perfectly preserved everything appeared. The company houses still stood in their orderly rows, their paint faded but intact, and the main street looked like a film set dressed for a period piece about coal country in the 1960s. There was the general store with its hand-painted sign advertising prices that would have been reasonable half a century ago, the small post office with its flag still hanging from a rusted pole, and the company office where miners would have received their pay in scrip instead of real money. Helena parked her car in front of what used to be the town diner, a modest building with a counter visible through the grimy windows, and the silence that greeted her when she stepped out was absolute and suffocating. No birds sang in the trees, no insects buzzed in the late afternoon warmth, no wind moved through the leaves. It was as though Zenith existed in a bubble separate from the natural world, a place where the normal rules of life had been suspended by some force that Helena couldn't begin to understand. She pulled out her camera and started documenting, taking wide shots of the empty streets and close-ups of details that suggested interrupted lives. A bicycle lying on its side in a front yard, a coffee cup sitting on a porch railing, a pair of work boots placed neatly by a door, as though their owner had just stepped inside and would be returning any moment. The sun dropped lower, and Helena worked quickly, aware that she needed to finish her preliminary documentation before darkness fell completely. She tried the door of the general store and found it unlocked, the hinges protesting with a squeal that seemed obscenely loud in the unnatural quiet. Inside the store was a time capsule that made her hands tremble as she raised her camera. Products still lined the shelves, their packaging yellowed with age but otherwise intact, brands that hadn't existed in decades sitting exactly where they'd been placed by the last person to stock them. The cash register was open, showing bills and coins and denominations that dated the scene precisely. And on the counter sat a pad of paper with a pencil resting across it, a list of items written in neat cursive that ended mid-word, as though the writer had been interrupted mid-thought. Helena photographed everything, her journalist's instincts overriding the growing unease that crawled up her spine like spiders. She moved to the back of the store and found the door to what must have been a storage room, and when she pushed it open, she discovered something that made her drop her camera, the expensive equipment clattering to the floor forgotten. The storage room was full of clocks, dozens of them, pulled from houses throughout Zenith and piled haphazardly in the small space. Wall clocks, alarm clocks, watches, even the clock from the store's own wall, all of them showing the same time, 3:17. Helena stood in the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs, and understood that someone had collected these after the vanishing, had gone through the abandoned town and gathered evidence of the exact moment when whatever happened had occurred. She picked up her camera with shaking hands and documented the clock collection, each photograph feeling like she was capturing proof of something that defied natural law. When she backed out of the storage room, the light outside had changed, the golden hour giving way to the blue dimness of approaching dusk, and Helena realized with a start that she'd lost track of time in a way that felt dangerous in this place. She exited the general store and looked down the main street, and that's when she noticed something that stopped her cold. The shadows cast by the buildings and the few remaining trees weren't aligned with the setting sun. They stretched in wrong directions, some pointing east when they should point west, others seeming to originate from no light source at all. And as Helena watched with growing horror, one of the shadows moved independently, sliding across the dusty street like it belonged to something she couldn't see. Helena ran back to her car, her journalist's objectivity finally breaking under the weight of wrongness that permeated every inch of Zenith. She fumbled with her keys, dropped them, snatched them up again, and managed to get the door unlocked and herself inside. The engine started on the first try, and she'd never been more grateful for reliable German engineering in her life. But when she put the car in reverse and checked her mirrors, she saw them. People standing in the doorways of the company houses, dozens of them, men in mining clothes, and women in dresses that hadn't been fashionable since the Johnson administration, children holding toys from a bygone era. They weren't moving, weren't approaching, just standing and watching her, with expressions that held no emotion Helena could identify. She could see them clearly despite the failing light, could make out details of their faces and clothing, but there was something wrong about them, something that her brain refused to process properly. They looked flat somehow, like photographs made three-dimensional, and their eyes reflected the last of the daylight in a way that human eyes shouldn't. Helena slammed the car into drive and accelerated, her tires kicking up dust as she fled down the main street toward the road that had brought her into this nightmare. In her rearview mirror, she saw the figures step out into the street, moving in perfect synchronization. And then the sun finally dropped below the mountains, and true darkness fell on Zenith like a curtain. The drive out was worse than the drive in, because Helena could feel the town resisting her departure, could sense something pulling at her car, like invisible hands trying to drag her back. Her headlights cut through the darkness and illuminated things she didn't want to see. More figures standing alongside the road, watching her pass with their two flat faces and reflecting eyes. Her compass, mounted on the dashboard, spun wildly just as the old man had warned, the needle whirling in endless circles that made her stomach lurch with motion sickness. Time felt elastic and unreliable, seconds stretching into minutes or compressing into instants, and Helena had no idea how long she'd actually been driving when she finally crossed whatever boundary separated Zenith from the rest of reality. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Sound returned in a rush, crickets chirping, wind in the trees, the normal ambient noise of a Kentucky mountain evening. And her compass needle snapped back to pointing north with such force she heard the mechanism crack. Helena didn't stop driving until she reached the next town, a place called Martin, that had actual people moving around and lights in windows, and she sat in the parking lot of a motel shaking so hard she could barely hold her phone to call her editor. The photographs came out wrong when she tried to upload them that night in her motel room. The images, corrupted by digital artifacts that formed patterns she didn't want to examine too closely, shapes that might have been figures or might have been pareidolia driven by trauma. Only one image survived intact, a shot of the general store's interior showing the counter, and the cash register and the pad of paper with its interrupted list. But there was something in the photograph that Helena didn't remember seeing when she'd taken it, a reflection in the mirror behind the counter, showing a figure that definitely hadn't been there. A woman in a faded dress standing in the doorway and watching Helena work, her face frozen in an expression that might have been warning or might have been hunger. Helena never went back to Zenith, never finished the story she'd intended to write, and when other journalists asked her about it at conferences and networking events, she'd changed the subject with a skill that suggested practice. She'd kept one thing from her grandmother's box of photographs, the image with the caption about God turning his face away, and sometimes, late at night, she'd look at it and wonder what her grandmother had known, what she'd seen that had made her leave Zenith just weeks before the vanishing. The official story, such as it existed, claimed that the residents had relocated en masse due to mine closures, a coordinated exodus that had simply been poorly documented. But Helena knew better, knew that 203 people hadn't left Zenith in 1967. They'd been taken, or transformed, or caught in some temporal trap that left them suspended between existence and absence, still living their last normal day in an endless loop while the world moved on without them. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some ghost towns are ghost towns for reasons that make keeping your distance the only sane response in Verified Souls family Zenith is one place where the questions you might answer are far more dangerous than any truth you might find. The woman appeared on a Tuesday morning in March of 1989, walking down the single dirt road that connected Panther Creek to the rest of the world, wearing a dress that belonged in a museum and carrying herself with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of corsets and social conventions from another century. Winter Hayes was the first person to see her, hanging laundry in her backyard when movement caught her eye, and what struck Winter immediately wasn't just the woman's antiquated clothing, but the fact that she was walking barefoot through mud and gravel without seeming to notice or care. Panther Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else going back 3 or 4 generations, where strangers were rare enough to be noteworthy and mysterious strangers were unheard of entirely. So Winter did what any curious neighbor would do. She called out a greeting, asked if the woman needed help, and received a response that would set in motion 3 months of events that nobody in Panther Creek would ever be able to fully explain or forget. The woman stopped walking, turned to face Winter with a smile that seemed practiced and formal, and introduced herself as Carmen Whitfield, wife of Reverend Thomas Whitfield, and said she'd been away visiting family and was returning home to the parsonage. Winter felt something cold move through her chest because Thomas Whitfield was indeed the preacher at Panther Creek Baptist Church, and Winter had known him for 15 years, and in all that time he'd been a bachelor who'd never once mentioned a wife or even a romantic interest. Carmen moved into the parsonage that same day, and Thomas seemed as surprised as everyone else, but in a way that suggested confusion rather than joy, like a man trying to remember something important that kept slipping away from his grasp. He didn't contradict Carmen's claim to be his wife, didn't send her away or call for help, just accepted her presence with a bewildered courtesy that the congregation found deeply unsettling. Carmen fit into the community with an ease that should have been impossible for someone so obviously out of place and out of time. She attended church services sitting in the front pew with perfect posture and singing hymns in a clear soprano voice, She visited the sick with appropriate concern and old-fashioned remedies that actually seemed to work, and she hosted a women's Bible study at the parsonage every Thursday afternoon, where she served tea in china cups and spoke about Scripture with an interpretation that felt both deeply knowledgeable and strangely archaic. The women of Panther Creek didn't know what to make of her, this anachronism who'd appeared from nowhere and claimed a place in their community as though she'd always belonged there. Some found her charming in an eccentric way. Others found her unsettling, but nobody could deny that she knew things about Panther Creek that a stranger shouldn't know, details about families and history and events that predated living memory. It was Carmen's speech that caused the most comment among the residents, the way she talked like someone who'd learned English from books written a century ago, formal and precise with vocabulary choices that sounded like they belonged in a Victorian novel. She said shall instead of will and referred to the general store as the mercantile and called unmarried women maidens in a way that might have been charming if it wasn't so consistent and unconscious. She seemed genuinely confused by modern conveniences, staring at electric lights like they were miracles and treating the telephone in the parsonage as though it might bite her if she got too close. When Elijah Morton tried to take Carmen's photograph at the church social, Carmen had recoiled in what looked like genuine fear, saying something about stealing souls and graven images before composing herself and apologizing for her silly notions. The photograph came out anyway, but Carmen's figure in it was blurred and indistinct, as though she'd moved during the exposure, even though Elijah swore she'd been standing perfectly still. These oddities accumulated like snow, small details that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested something deeply wrong about Carmen Whitfield and her sudden appearance in Panther Creek. Thomas himself seemed to exist in a fog during those 3 months, going through the motions of his pastoral duties, but with a distraction that worried his congregation. He preached his sermons from notes that seemed unfamiliar to him, stumbling over words and losing his place, and during counseling sessions, he would sometimes stop mid-sentence and stare at nothing, as though listening to voices only he could hear. His sister Liana drove up from Knoxville in late April, concerned by phone calls that had become increasingly incoherent, and she was the one who finally asked the questions everyone else had been too polite or too frightened to voice. She sat Thomas down in his study while Carmen was out visiting a shut-in church member, and she asked him directly about his wife, about when they'd met and where they'd married, and why he'd never mentioned her to his own family. Thomas looked at his sister with eyes that held confusion and something that might have been terror, and he told her a truth that made Liana's blood run cold. He wasn't married, had never been married, had no idea who Carmen really was or where she'd come from. But whenever he tried to send her away or confront her about her presence, the words would die in his throat, and his thoughts would scatter like leaves in a wind, and he'd find himself accepting her claim to be his wife, even though every rational part of his mind knew it was impossible. Liana decided to do what Thomas apparently couldn't, and she went to the county records office in the town of Mountain City, searching for any documentation of a marriage between Thomas Whitfield and anyone named Carmen. What she found instead was something that sent her racing back to Panther Creek, with her hands shaking on the steering wheel. In the archives of the Panther Creek Baptist Church, stored in boxes that hadn't been disturbed in decades, there were records from the 1840s detailing the ministry of a Reverend Thomas Whitfield, the church's founding pastor. The records showed that Reverend Whitfield had been engaged to marry a young woman named Carmen Hale in the autumn of 1847, but the wedding never took place because Carmen had died in a fire that swept through her family's farmhouse in September of that year. The fire had been ruled suspicious, whispers of arson floating through the small community, and some believed Carmen's father had set it himself. After learning his daughter intended to marry a preacher, he considered beneath their family's social standing. Reverend Whitfield had never married after Carmen's death, had served the church for another 30 years in solitary dedication, and was buried in the old cemetery on the hill behind the church building. Liana found his grave that same afternoon, a weathered headstone that confirmed the dates and the name, and beside it was a smaller stone marking a plot that had never been filled, carved with Carmen Hale's name and the inscription, "Beloved of Thomas, taken too soon." The confrontation happened on a Sunday evening after services, with most of the congregation still present, because Liana had asked them to stay, had told them there was something they all needed to know. She laid out what she'd discovered, showed them copies of the old church records and photographs of the gravestones, and demanded that Carmen explain who she really was and what she wanted. Carmen sat in the front pew throughout Liana's presentation, her hands folded in her lap and her expression serene, and when it was finally her turn to speak, she did so with a dignity that made several of the older women start crying without quite knowing why. She confirmed that she was indeed Carmen Hale, or what remained of her, that she'd been dead for 142 years, and that she'd been given a chance to return for a brief time to live the life that had been stolen from her by violence and hatred. She didn't know who or what had granted her this opportunity, only that she'd awakened on that March morning with knowledge of how to find Panther Creek, and a certainty that Thomas was waiting for her here. She understood now that she'd been confused, that the Thomas Whitfield of this time wasn't her Thomas, but the pull of that name and that calling had been too strong to resist. She'd spent 3 months living in a dream of the life she should have had, and she was grateful for it. But she could feel her time running out like sand through an hourglass, and she knew she wouldn't be able to stay much longer. The congregation didn't know how to respond to this confession, torn between disbelief and the evidence of their own experiences with Carmen's impossible knowledge and anachronistic behavior. Thomas, freed somehow by Carmen's honesty, spoke for the first time with clarity, asking her what she needed, how they could help her find peace. Carmen's smile was sad and gentle, and she said there was nothing anyone could do, that some debts could only be paid by time itself, but she had one request before she left. She wanted to be married, wanted to stand before God and this community and speak the vows she'd been denied, even if the Thomas standing beside her was separated from her Thomas by the unbridgeable gulf of more than a century. It was the strangest wedding Panther Creek had ever witnessed. Thomas Whitfield marrying a woman who admitted she was a ghost, speaking words that everyone knew were symbolic rather than legal, participating in a ceremony that existed outside any normal understanding of reality. Carmen wore her old-fashioned dress, and Thomas wore his Sunday suit, and the church was full of witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what they'd seen to people who hadn't been there. Carmen disappeared during the reception, between one moment and the next, there and then not there, vanishing like morning mist when the sun finally burns through. The congregation searched the church and the parsonage and the surrounding woods, but they found no trace of her except for a single item left on the altar, a locket containing a small painted portrait of a young man who looked remarkably like Thomas Whitfield, but wore the severe clothing of the 19th century. Thomas kept that locket, wore it under his shirt for the rest of his ministry, and he never married in the conventional sense, saying that he'd already had his wedding, and one was enough for any man. The story of Carmen Whitfield became legend in Panther Creek, told and retold with variations, but always maintaining the core truth that for 3 months in 1989, a woman from 1847 had walked among them, had lived a life stolen by violence, and had finally found the peace that comes from completing unfinished business. Some people said it was mass delusion, that the whole community had somehow convinced themselves of an impossibility. But those who'd been there knew what they'd experienced, knew they'd touched something that existed outside the normal flow of time. Liana went back to the cemetery one final time before returning to Knoxville, and she found that the empty grave beside Reverend Thomas Whitfield's headstone was no longer empty. Fresh earth filled the plot, as though someone had been buried there recently, and the inscription on Carmen Hale's stone had changed, adding a new line below the original epitaph, "Found at last, 1989. Nobody had dug that grave, nobody had seen it being filled, but the earth was real, and the grass was already beginning to grow over it. And Panther Creek accepted what couldn't be explained, because sometimes love refuses to recognize the boundaries of death, and sometimes the universe grants second chances to those who were wronged. And in the forgotten hollows of Appalachia, where time moves differently, and the past never fully releases its grip on the present, anything becomes possible if you're willing to believe in mysteries that defy rational understanding." Holly's grandmother had warned her about the screaming before she'd even unpacked her bags, sitting on the sagging porch of the old family house with a glass of sweet tea, and eyes that had seen too many years in Roderfield to hold any illusions about the place. The screaming would start around 2 in the morning, her grandmother explained, in a matter-of-fact tone usually reserved for discussing weather patterns or grocery prices. A man's voice echoing through the mountains with such raw agony that it would wake every soul in the hollow and keep them awake until 3 or so, when it finally stopped. Holly had nodded politely, assuming this was the kind of local folklore that small mountain communities cultivated to keep themselves interesting, ghost stories told, to entertain outsiders, and give teenagers something to dare each other about on weekend nights. She'd moved to Roderfield temporarily to help her grandmother recover from hip surgery, taking a leave of absence from her teaching job in Charleston, and she figured a few months in a dying coal town would give her time to work on the novel she'd been threatening to write for years. The screaming, she assumed, was probably just an owl or some other nocturnal creature that sounded human-like when filtered through mountain acoustics and local superstition. She would learn how wrong she was at exactly 2:13 on her first night in the house, when a sound, unlike anything she'd ever heard, tore through the darkness and jolted her from sleep, with her heart trying to punch through her rib cage. It wasn't an animal sound, wasn't anything that could be explained by wildlife or wind or the settling of old houses. It was a man screaming in absolute terror and pain, the kind of sound that came from someone experiencing horrors beyond human endurance, and it echoed through the hollow with a clarity that made it impossible to determine direction or distance. Holly sat up in bed, her grandmother's old quilt clutched to her chest, and listened as the screaming continued without pause for breath, without variation in intensity, just an endless wail of suffering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. She grabbed her phone and pulled up the recording app, some instinct telling her that she needed to document this, and she captured 3 full minutes of the screaming before it finally cut off as abruptly as it had started, leaving a silence that felt almost worse than the noise. Her grandmother appeared in the doorway of Holly's bedroom, backlit by the hallway light, leaning on her walker and looking unsurprised. "Told you," was all she said, and then shuffled back to her own room as though demonic screaming at 2 in the morning was just another normal aspect of life in Roderfield that you learned to accept, like black lung or company script. The next morning, Holly played the recording back and found that it had captured nothing, just 3 minutes of dead air with occasional static, pops that might have been her phone's microphone struggling with silence. She tried to convince herself that she'd dreamed it, that the stress of the move and worry about her grandmother had manifested as an auditory hallucination, but the circles under the eyes of every person she encountered at the general store told a different story. Everyone in Roderfield had heard the screaming, had been hearing it for decades, and they'd all learned to live with it the way people learn to live with chronic pain or tinnitus, an unwelcome constant that you eventually stopped noticing consciously, even though it never really went away. The store clerk, a woman named Matewan, who looked about 60 but was probably younger, told Holly that the screaming had been happening since at least 1954, when her own mother had first moved to Roderfield as a young bride. Some said it was a ghost, others said it was something stranger, but everyone agreed that it was connected to the old number 4 mine shaft up on Porter's Ridge, and everyone agreed that you didn't go looking for the source if you had any sense of self-preservation. People who went searching for the hollering man, as he'd been dubbed by locals, tended to come back changed, Madeline explained, and a few hadn't come back at all. Their disappearances explained away as people leaving town for work or family, but explained away a little too quickly and with a little too much insistence. Holly spent her days caring for her grandmother, and her nights lying awake waiting for 2 o'clock, and the screaming came every single night without fail, as reliable as a train schedule and just as impossible to ignore. She started researching Roderfield's history, spending time at the county library in the nearest actual town, digging through newspaper archives and mining company records that had been donated years ago by families who'd finally given up and moved away. What she found was a story of labor conflict and violence that seemed depressingly typical for coal country, but with details that made her skin crawl. In 1954, the miners at Number 4 had been organizing for better safety conditions and fair wages, pushing back against a company that treated them as expendable resources rather than human beings. The mine supervisor, a man named Earl Hutchins, had been brought in specifically to break the organizing effort, and he'd done his job with a brutality that even the company's own records hinted at. Miners who spoke up about safety violations found themselves assigned to the most dangerous sections of the shaft. Miners who attended union meetings had accidents that left them too injured to work, and miners who refused to back down simply disappeared, with the official explanation being that they'd abandoned their families and fled to find work elsewhere, even though everyone knew that coal miners in 1954 didn't have the luxury of just picking up and leaving. Earl Hutchins himself had disappeared in October of 1954, vanishing between the end of his shift and his expected arrival at home. And the company had been quick to close the investigation, calling it a case of a man leaving town to avoid debts or domestic trouble. But the miners knew different, whispered among themselves about justice finally being served, about Hutchins getting what he'd had coming, and about how his screams had echoed through the mountains on his last night, even though nobody could quite agree on where he'd been or what had happened to him. The screaming had started shortly after, that nightly 2 to 3 a.m. chorus of agony that had been waking Roderfield's residents for 71 years now, and older folks said it started the week after Hutchins disappeared, as though whatever had taken him was making sure everyone knew exactly how much he was suffering. Holly found a photograph of Earl Hutchins in the company records, a stern-faced man with cold eyes and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile, and she felt no sympathy for whatever fate had befallen him. But the screaming still disturbed her on a level that went beyond the simple discomfort of being startled awake each night. There was something about it that felt wrong in a fundamental way, as though it represented a violation of natural law that the universe itself found offensive but couldn't correct. 3 weeks into her stay, Holly made a decision that her grandmother told her was foolish, and that the locals told her was dangerous, but that her writer's curiosity and stubborn streak wouldn't let her ignore. She was going up to Number 4 to see if she could find the source of the screaming, and she was going to do it during the day when whatever haunted those mountains might be less active or at least less able to do harm. Madeline at the general store tried to talk her out of it, listing the names of people who'd gone looking and come back wrong or not come back at all. But Holly was 34 years old and had a master's degree in literature and didn't believe that avoiding questions was how you found answers. She hiked up to Porter's Ridge on a bright Tuesday afternoon, following an old mining road that had been reclaimed by vegetation but was still visible if you knew what to look for, and she found Number 4 without much difficulty. The mine entrance had been sealed decades ago, concrete and steel barriers preventing access, but the area around it felt wrong in a way Holly couldn't quite articulate. The temperature was noticeably colder near the sealed entrance, and the bird song that had accompanied her hike up the mountain went completely silent once she got within 100 yards of the shaft. The silence was oppressive and unnatural, as though sound itself was being absorbed by something hungry. Holly approached the sealed entrance carefully, her phone out and recording video this time, documenting everything she saw. There were marks on the concrete barrier, deep scratches that looked like they'd been made from the inside, and dark stains that might have been rust from the steel reinforcements, or might have been something else entirely. She pressed her hand against the concrete and jerked it back immediately, because the barrier was ice cold despite the afternoon sun beating down on it, and she'd felt something through the concrete, a vibration, like a heartbeat or machinery running somewhere deep in the earth. That's when she heard it, faint but unmistakable even in the middle of the afternoon, a sound like someone breathing heavily in the darkness beyond the barrier. And then a voice, hoarse and broken, whispering words she couldn't quite make out. Holly stumbled backward, her foot catching on a piece of old mining equipment, and she fell hard on the rocky ground. The whispering stopped, and in the silence that followed, Holly heard footsteps on the other side of the concrete, slow and deliberate, moving closer to where she'd been standing. She didn't wait to hear more, didn't try to document anything further, just scrambled to her feet and ran back down the mountain with a speed born of pure animal panic. That night, the screaming started at exactly 2 a.m. as always, but Holly swore it sounded different, more focused somehow, and when she crept to her bedroom window and looked out at the dark mountains, she could see a faint light on Porter's Ridge, right about where number 4 would be. Her grandmother found her there at 3:15, still staring at the mountain, and the old woman's expression held more disappointment than surprise. "You went up there," her grandmother said, not a question but a statement, and Holly nodded mutely. Her grandmother sighed and told her a truth that the rest of Roderfield had learned long ago. Earl Hutchins hadn't just been killed by the miners he'd tormented. They'd sealed him in an abandoned section of number 4 while he was still alive, left him in the darkness to starve and suffocate, and they'd done it in such a way that his death would take days. The screaming was Earl Hutchins reliving those days every night, trapped in a loop of suffering that he couldn't escape and that Roderfield couldn't silence. And the people who went looking for him, who went up to number 4 trying to find the source, sometimes heard him call out in the afternoon quiet, sometimes heard him beg for help or water or mercy, and those people found it hard to sleep afterward, found the screaming louder in their ears, found themselves haunted by sympathy for a man who deserved his fate, but who'd suffered more than any human being should have to suffer. Holly left Roderfield 2 weeks later, hiring a nurse to help her grandmother, and returning to Charleston with a check she sent monthly to cover expenses. She told herself it was because her leave of absence was ending, because she needed to get back to her job, but the truth was that she couldn't stand another night of the screaming, couldn't stop. Hearing Earl Hutchins's afternoon whispers begging for water, couldn't stop thinking about justice versus cruelty and where the line between them disappeared into something monstrous. The novel she'd planned to write stayed unwritten, because Holly found she couldn't put words on paper without hearing that voice in her memory. And she couldn't create fiction when she'd touched a truth so horrible that it had been echoing through the mountains for 71 years without mercy or resolution. Her grandmother lived another 3 years in that house, sleeping through the screaming every night the way she'd slept through it for decades. And when she finally passed, Holly sold the property to a couple from out of state who didn't ask about local folklore or strange sounds. Holly wondered sometimes if she should have warned them, but she figured they'd learned soon enough, the way everyone who stayed in Roderfield learned, that some debts get paid in installments that last forever, and some ghosts scream not because they want forgiveness, but because the universe demands that certain sins be remembered every single night until the mountains themselves crumble into dust and the hollows finally go silent. For the Verified Souls family watching this, remember that revenge might feel righteous in the moment, but cruelty echoes through time in ways that punish everyone within earshot. And sometimes the only thing worse than being the victim is being the person who has to listen to the victim suffering night after night after night without any power to make it stop. The substitute teacher arrived at Lick Creek's one-room schoolhouse on a Monday morning in October 1978, filling in for Mrs. Patterson, who'd come down with pneumonia and wouldn't be back for at least 2 weeks. Phoenix Reynolds was fresh out of college with an education degree and idealistic notions about making a difference in rural communities, and Lick Creek seemed like exactly the kind of forgotten place where a young teacher could have an impact. The schoolhouse served children from kindergarten through 8th grade, all 23 of them taught in a single room with lessons organized by grade level, and Phoenix had spent the weekend preparing materials and psyching herself up for the challenge of managing multiple age groups simultaneously. She arrived early that Monday, unlocked the schoolhouse with the key the district office had provided, and spent an hour arranging the classroom and reviewing the roster Mrs. Patterson had left for her. 23 names, 23 students from families that had lived in this isolated Virginia hollow for generations. Families whose names appeared on Civil War records and land deeds going back 200 years. Phoenix memorized those names the way her education professors had taught her, planning to greet each child personally and build rapport from the first moment. And she was standing at the door with a welcoming smile when the students started arriving around 8:30. The children came in small clusters, dropped off by parents in pickup trucks or walking up the dirt road from houses scattered throughout the hollow, and Phoenix checked them off her list as they introduced themselves and found their desks. Everything proceeded normally until 9:15, 15 minutes after the official start of school, when 3 more children walked through the door, looking slightly disheveled and out of breath. They were young, probably 2nd or 3rd grade, and they gave their names as Raylan Morrison, Willa Cutler, and Helen Jenkins, apologizing for being late and explaining that they'd overslept. Phoenix checked her roster and found all 3 names listed, made a mental note to mention the tardiness to their parents at some point, and directed them to their appropriate desks. The morning lessons went smoothly, with Phoenix dividing her attention between grade levels and feeling a growing confidence that she could handle this assignment. But around 10:30 during the arithmetic lesson for the younger students, the schoolhouse door opened again and 3 women entered, and Phoenix's carefully constructed sense of control began to crumble. The women were clearly mothers, wearing the practical clothing of rural Virginia and carrying the kind of tension in their shoulders that suggested worry about children, and they scanned the classroom with anxious eyes until they spotted Raylan, Willa, and Helen sitting at their desks working on math problems. The tallest of the 3 women, introducing herself as Sarah Morrison, walked directly to Raylan's desk and stared at the child sitting there with an expression that Phoenix couldn't quite interpret, something between recognition and rejection, familiarity and strangeness. "That's not my daughter," Sarah said quietly, and the other 2 women echoed her sentiment, looking at the children sitting at Willa's and Helen's desks and making the same impossible claim. Phoenix felt confusion wash over her, because the children sitting at those desks looked exactly like you'd expect Raylan Morrison, Willa Cutler, and Helen Jenkins to look based on the family resemblance to the women claiming they weren't their daughters. The children had the same hair color, the same facial features, the same everything that would make them identifiable as belonging to these particular families. But the mothers were adamant, their voices rising with something that sounded like fear, insisting that these were not their children, despite all evidence to the contrary. The children themselves seemed confused and hurt by their mother's rejection, Raylan starting to cry and asking why her mama was saying such awful things, Willa reaching out to touch her mother's hand and being pushed away, Helen sitting frozen at her desk, with tears streaming down her face while maintaining a silence that was somehow more disturbing than the others crying. Phoenix tried to mediate, tried to understand what was happening, but the situation spiraled beyond her control when other parents started arriving, summoned by phone calls from the 3 mothers, and the schoolhouse became crowded with adults arguing and children crying and Phoenix standing in the middle of it all feeling like she'd stumbled into a nightmare disguised as a normal school day. The consensus among the parents was chilling and unanimous. The three children sitting at those desks were not Raylan Morrison, Willa Cutler, and Helen Jenkins, despite looking exactly like them, despite knowing personal details about their families, despite insisting with increasing desperation that they were who they said they were. Something was wrong with them, the parents agreed. Something indefinable but undeniable. An uncanny wrongness that made parental instincts scream danger, even when logic said these were their children. Phoenix made the decision to call the sheriff, figuring this was beyond her capacity to handle, and possibly indicating some kind of mental health crisis affecting multiple adults simultaneously. Sheriff Dawson arrived within 30 minutes, a man in his 50s who'd been handling Lick Creek's minimal law enforcement needs for 2 decades, and Phoenix explained the situation, expecting him to sort it out with calm authority and reasonable explanations. Instead, Sheriff Dawson took one look at the 3 children in question, and his weathered face went pale, and he asked Phoenix to step outside with him, while his deputy stayed in the schoolhouse to keep things calm. Outside, standing by his patrol car in the autumn sunshine that suddenly felt too bright and too normal for the strangeness happening inside the schoolhouse, Sheriff Dawson told Phoenix something that made her question everything she thought she understood about reality. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened in Lick Creek, he explained, his voice low and reluctant. Back in 1952, a boy had shown up claiming to be Jacob Reeves, and he looked exactly like Jacob Reeves, but his parents had insisted he wasn't their son, and eventually that boy had just disappeared, vanished between one day and the next, and the real Jacob Reeves had been found 3 days later, wandering confused in the woods with no memory of where he'd been. The situation inside the schoolhouse resolved itself in the most disturbing way possible when Phoenix and Sheriff Dawson returned to find the 3 children gone. They hadn't walked out the door, hadn't been seen leaving by anyone present. It simply ceased to be there sometime during the 5 minutes Phoenix had been outside. The desks where they'd been sitting were empty, their pencils and papers still present, and the other students reported that one moment the 3 children had been there crying, and the next moment they'd just faded away like morning fog. Phoenix searched the schoolhouse frantically, checked the small bathroom and the coat closet, and looked under desks, but there was no trace of Raylan, Willa, and Helen, if those had even been their real names. The parents who'd rejected them stood in shocked silence, and Phoenix could see them struggling with guilt and relief in equal measure, glad that the wrong children were gone, but horrified by what their departure suggested about the nature of reality in Lick Creek. Sheriff Dawson called his office and organized a search of the surrounding woods, following protocol even though his expression suggested he knew they wouldn't find anything, and Phoenix canceled school for the rest of the day and sent the remaining students home with notes explaining that there had been an incident that required investigation. The real Raylan Morrison, Willa Cutler, and Helen Jenkins were found later that afternoon, all 3 of them discovered in different locations throughout Lick Creek, confused and disoriented, and with no memory of the morning at all. Raylan was found sleeping in her family's barn, curled up in the hay like a cat seeking warmth. Willa was discovered sitting by the creek that gave the hollow its name, staring at the water with blank eyes. Helen was located in the old cemetery on the hill, sitting cross-legged between her grandparents' graves and humming a song nobody recognized. All 3 children were examined by the doctor who served the rural communities in the county, and he found them physically healthy but emotionally disturbed in ways he couldn't quite explain, a disconnection that suggested trauma even though they couldn't remember experiencing anything traumatic. Their last clear memories were of going to bed Sunday night, and then suddenly it was Monday afternoon, and they were waking up in strange places with everyone asking them questions they couldn't answer. Phoenix interviewed each child separately, using her training in educational psychology, and what she learned made her hands shake so badly she could barely write notes. All 3 children reported the same dream. If it had been a dream, of being somewhere dark and cold where voices spoke to them in language that wasn't quite language, more like concepts being pressed directly into their minds. The voices had been curious about them, examining them the way a scientist might examine specimens, asking questions about their lives and families and the world they came from. The children described being measured and studied, not painfully but thoroughly, and they all mentioned seeing others like themselves, children who looked wrong somehow, standing in rows waiting for something. Raylan said she'd seen a boy who looked almost like her cousin but with eyes that were slightly too far apart. Willa described a girl with her friend's face, but hands that had too many fingers. Helen, the youngest at 7 years old, said there had been hundreds of them, all wrong in small ways, all waiting to be sent out to replace the originals. The children couldn't explain how they'd ended up back in Lick Creek, couldn't remember the transition between that dark place and waking up in the barn or by the creek or in the cemetery, but they all agreed that something had changed its mind about keeping them, had decided to send them back and take the copies instead, and Phoenix found herself believing them despite how impossible it all sounded. Mrs. Patterson returned to teaching 2 weeks later, her pneumonia resolved, and Phoenix left Lick Creek with a recommendation for permanent positions in 3 different school districts, none of which she accepted. She couldn't shake the memory of those 3 children who'd looked exactly right but felt exactly wrong, couldn't stop thinking about the parents' instinctive rejection of children who should have been theirs. Phoenix had grown up believing that maternal instinct was just cultural conditioning, that the bond between parent and child was learned rather than innate, but Lick Creek had taught her otherwise. Those mothers had known, on some level, that bypassed rational thought, that the children sitting at those desks weren't their children despite all physical evidence suggesting otherwise. Something fundamental was missing or wrong, some essential quality that made a person themselves rather than just a copy of themselves, and whatever intelligence had created those copies hadn't quite managed to replicate it perfectly. Phoenix changed careers after Lick Creek, going into library science instead of teaching, and she never worked with children again because she couldn't look at students without wondering if they were really who they appeared to be. The 3 real children grew up in Lick Creek and seemed to suffer no lasting effects from their experience, or at least no effects visible to outsiders. They didn't talk about what had happened to them, had been instructed by parents and sheriff to keep quiet about the whole incident, and Lick Creek closed ranks around the story the way small communities always do around things that threaten their sense of safety. But Phoenix kept track of them over the years through Christmas cards exchanged with Mrs. Patterson, and she noticed a pattern that chilled her blood every time she thought about it. None of the 3 children ever had kids of their own, despite getting married and seeming to want families. Raylan had 3 miscarriages before giving up. Willa's attempts at IVF all failed for reasons doctors couldn't explain. Helen simply never got pregnant despite trying for 10 years. It was as though something had been taken from them during those hours they couldn't remember, some essential piece of themselves that involved the ability to create new life, and Phoenix wondered if that had been the trade. The children got to come back, but they had to leave something behind, had to sacrifice their potential for children of their own. She wondered, too, about the copies, about where they'd gone when they'd faded away from the schoolhouse, whether they'd been destroyed or repurposed, or sent somewhere else to try again with families who might not notice the wrongness. And late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, Phoenix would think about Sheriff Dawson saying this had happened before, would think about Jacob Reeves in 1952, and would wonder how many times this had occurred in Lick Creek's history, how many children had been temporarily replaced by something that studied them and learned from them and created copies that were almost but not quite right. Some mysteries don't want to be solved because the answers would shatter our understanding of reality. And Lick Creek was one of those mysteries, a place where the veil between our world and something else wore thin enough that substitutions could occur, and the only defense against having your child replaced was the instinct that told you when something was wrong even when everything looked right, in verified soul's family. Maybe that's the most terrifying thought of all, that we could be replaced, and nobody would know except the people who love us, and they'd know only because of something they felt rather than something they could prove. Emily purchased the hunting cabin outside Helvetia for almost nothing, a foreclosure sale that the real estate agent seemed overly eager to close despite the property's obvious appeal of mountain views and private acreage. The cabin itself needed work, but had good bones, and the price was so low that Emily figured even if she only used it a few weekends a year, it would be worth the investment. She was a wildlife photographer by profession, someone who spent weeks at a time in remote locations capturing images of animals in their natural habitats, and the idea of having a base camp in the North Carolina mountains appealed to her practical nature. The real estate agent, a nervous woman named Alessandra, who kept checking her watch throughout the closing process, mentioned almost as an afterthought that hunting wasn't particularly good in the area anymore, that most of the local hunters had moved on to other locations. But Emily wasn't planning to hunt anyway, so the information barely registered. She moved into the cabin on a Friday in late September, brought supplies for a long weekend of settling in and exploring the property, and fell asleep that first night to the normal sounds of a mountain forest at night. Owls calling and small creatures rustling through undergrowth and wind moving through the trees. The wrongness started around 3 a.m, when Emily woke to silence so complete it felt oppressive, like her ears had stopped working or the world had ended while she slept. No owls, no rustling, no wind, just absolute quiet that pressed against her eardrums like water pressure. She lay in bed feeling uneasy without quite understanding why. And then she heard it, a sound so subtle and strange that her brain struggled to categorize it. The forest was breathing, and not in the metaphorical sense that writers use to describe wind moving through leaves. This was actual respiration, a rhythmic inhale and exhale that she could hear through the cabin's walls, as though the trees themselves had developed lungs and were drawing air in coordinated waves. Emily got out of bed and went to the window, and what she saw in the moonlight made her grip the windowsill hard enough that her knuckles went white. The trees were moving, not swaying like normal trees in wind, but expanding and contracting, their trunks visibly growing wider on the inhale and narrower on the exhale. And the sound that accompanied this motion was unmistakably biological, the wheeze and whisper of air moving through organic passages. Morning came, and the breathing stopped, the forest returning to normal appearance and behavior, and Emily stood on her porch with coffee, wondering if she'd experienced some kind of sleep paralysis, hallucination, or carbon monoxide exposure. She checked the cabin's ventilation, opened all the windows to air things out, and spent the day exploring the property and trying to convince herself that what she'd experienced had been a dream amplified by being alone in an unfamiliar place. The exploration took her about a quarter-mile west of the cabin, following an old logging road that hadn't been maintained in decades, and that's when she found the first evidence that something was deeply wrong with the forest around Helvetia. There was a section of woods where every single tree was dead, their bark blackened and peeling, their branches bare of leaves despite it being early autumn when everything else was displaying fall colors. The dead zone was roughly circular, maybe 50 yards in diameter, and at its center was what looked like a depression in the ground, a shallow bowl where something had been excavated and then filled in again. Emily approached cautiously, her photographer's eye documenting everything, and she noticed that nothing grew in this dead zone. No undergrowth, or mushrooms, or moss, just bare earth and dying trees standing like skeletal fingers, reaching toward a sky they could no longer touch. She found a marker at the edge of the dead zone, a weathered wooden post with carved letters that time and weather had nearly obliterated. But Emily could make out enough to understand what she was looking at. This had been a burial ground, and the logging company that had operated here in the 1920s had clear-cut directly over it, removing the trees that had marked sacred ground and disturbing whatever had been laid to rest beneath them. Emily pulled out her phone to take photographs and found that her camera wouldn't function, the lens refusing to focus, and the screen showing digital artifacts that formed patterns she didn't want to examine too closely. She backed away from the dead zone, and once she was about 20 feet beyond its edge, her phone returned to normal function, the camera working perfectly and showing no trace of the previous malfunction. The rest of the day passed in research, Emily driving into the nearest town with functional internet and spending hours in the public library digging through historical records and newspaper archives, building a picture of Helvetia's history that explained everything and made the breathing forest suddenly terrifyingly logical. Helvetia had been a logging town in the early 1920s, one of dozens that sprang up throughout Appalachia to harvest old-growth timber for a nation hungry for lumber. The company that operated here, Mountain Timber Corporation, had been notorious even by the low standards of the era for its disregard of both environmental concerns and local sensibilities. They'd logged areas that locals had warned them to leave alone, had ignored property boundaries and cultural sites, and had pushed their workers to dangerous extremes to meet production quotas. In 1923, they'd begun operations in a section of forest that the Cherokee families still living in the area had explicitly asked them to avoid, explaining that it was a burial ground for their ancestors, a place that should be respected and left undisturbed. The company had laughed off these concerns, had proceeded with clear-cutting, and within 2 weeks, accidents had started plaguing the operation. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that defied mechanical explanation. Trees fell in impossible directions, crushing men who should have been safely out of range, and workers reported hearing voices in the forest and seeing figures that disappeared when looked at directly. The company blamed worker carelessness and superstition. Right up until the morning, they found the entire night crew dead. 17 men working the night shift had died simultaneously, according to the newspaper reports Emily found, their bodies discovered by the day crew arranged in a circle around one of the massive stumps left by the logging operation. Medical examination couldn't determine a cause of death, found no signs of violence or poisoning or disease, concluded only that their hearts had stopped beating at the same moment for no reason medical science could identify. The logging company had abandoned operations immediately, walking away from expensive equipment and leaving Helvetia to die a slow death as the workers and their families scattered to other towns and other opportunities. The area had been avoided by locals ever since, sold and resold to outsiders who never stayed long, and Emily understood with growing horror that she'd bought herself a piece of that cursed history. She drove back to the cabin as the sun was setting, and she'd planned to pack up and leave immediately, to cut her losses and never return, but curiosity and professional pride made her pause. She was a photographer, someone who documented the natural world, and what was happening in this forest was unprecedented, impossible, and exactly the kind of thing that could make a career if she could capture it on camera. That night, Emily stayed awake, her camera equipment set up at the window, waiting for the breathing to start. It began at 3 a.m. exactly, as though something kept precise time, and this time Emily was ready. She photographed the trees as they expanded and contracted, captured video of their impossible respiration, documented everything with the methodical thoroughness of a professional who understood she was recording something that science would struggle to accept. The breathing continued for exactly 1 hour, and then at 4 a.m, something changed. The rhythm shifted, becoming faster and shallower, and Emily realized with a chill that spread through her entire body that the forest sounded distressed, like something struggling to breathe properly, fighting for air. She watched through her camera lens as one of the trees closest to her cabin began to move, not with the breathing rhythm, but with purpose, its roots tearing free of the earth and its branches reaching toward her window, like arms seeking embrace or attack. Emily dropped the camera and ran, grabbed her keys and her phone and nothing else, and made it to her car just as the tree's branches began scraping against the cabin's walls. She drove away from Helvetia without looking back, her headlights cutting through darkness that seemed too thick and too alive. And she didn't stop driving until she reached a highway rest stop 50 miles away, where the lights were bright and other people were present. The photographs and video she'd captured showed nothing unusual, just normal trees standing in normal forest. And Emily wondered if she'd imagined everything, or if whatever haunted those woods had the power to affect electronic recordings the same way it had affected her phone in the dead zone. She tried to sell the cabin remotely, listed it with a different real estate agent who didn't ask questions about why she'd only owned it for 3 days, and eventually it sold to another outsider who probably got the same deal Emily had gotten and would learn the same lessons Emily had learned. The research she did afterward, once she was safe in her apartment in Asheville and could think clearly again, revealed that the breathing forest had been reported by multiple previous owners, that several hunters had encountered it over the decades, and that the Cherokee families who'd originally warned the logging company had known exactly what they were protecting. The burial ground hadn't just been a place where bodies were interred. Emily learned from talking to a cultural historian who specialized in indigenous Appalachian traditions. It had been a site where certain individuals were buried according to specific rituals designed to maintain balance between the human world and the natural world, to honor the spirits of the forest and ensure their cooperation with the people who lived among the trees. When the logging company had desecrated that site, they'd broken something fundamental, had severed a relationship that had existed for centuries, and the forest had responded the only way it could. It had reclaimed the disturbed earth, had grown over the wounds, but the damage had fundamentally changed it, had given it a kind of consciousness or sensitivity that normal forests didn't possess. The breathing was the forest trying to heal itself, trying to expel the poison of desecration through respiration. And the reason it had become aggressive toward Emily was because she'd built her presence on land that the forest was slowly reclaiming as its own. Emily never went back to Helvetia, never tried to recover her camera equipment or the belongings she'd left behind, and when other photographers asked her about good locations for wildlife photography in North Carolina, she'd recommend anywhere except the mountains around Helvetia. Years later, Emily received a letter forwarded through her real estate agent from the person who'd bought her cabin, a brief note saying they were also selling and warning her never to return to the property or the surrounding area. The letter included a photograph, and Emily's hands shook when she looked at it, because the image showed her cabin almost completely engulfed by trees that had grown impossibly fast, their roots tearing through the foundation and their branches piercing the roof, reclaiming the structure with a determination that looked almost vindictive. The dead zone where the burial ground had been was expanding, the letter writer said, growing by several feet each year, and everything within it was dying not from disease or blight, but from something the soil itself was doing, as though the earth had decided to reject life entirely rather than allow further desecration. Emily filed the letter away and tried not to think about what it meant, tried not to imagine the forest continuing to breathe and expand and reclaim everything the logging company had taken, tried not to picture the day when Helvetia itself would be swallowed entirely by woods that had learned to defend themselves through methods that defied natural law. Some wounds don't heal, they fester and spread, and some acts of desecration create responses that last generations. And in the mountains of North Carolina, where the old growth was cut down and the sacred ground was violated, the forest remembers every insult and repays them with patience measured in decades, breathing in and breathing out, and slowly, inevitably, taking back what was always meant to be wild. The Verified Souls family should remember that nature isn't always the peaceful backdrop we imagine it to be. that sometimes when you take what isn't yours to take, the earth itself becomes an enemy that never forgives and never stops trying to correct the imbalance, one breath at a time. Gracelyn had inherited the old hospital building from an uncle she'd barely known, a man who'd bought the property decades ago with plans to renovate it into apartments that never materialized. And now it sat on her tax records like an anchor, dragging her finances down with maintenance costs and liability insurance. The building had been Lynch's company hospital back when the coal mines were operating, a 3-story brick structure that had served the medical needs of miners and their families from the 1920s through the early 1980s, when the last mine finally closed, and the town began its slow collapse into abandonment. Gracelyn lived in Lexington and had never even visited Lynch, but the inheritance came with enough cash to make dealing with the property worthwhile. So she took a week off work and made the drive into the mountains to assess what she was dealing with and decide whether to try selling it or just bulldozing it and taking the loss. She arrived on a gray afternoon in November, the kind of weather that made everything look depressing, and her first sight of the hospital did nothing to improve her mood. The building was deteriorating but still structurally sound, its windows mostly intact and its roof holding despite decades of neglect, and Gracelyn let herself in through the main entrance with keys her uncle's lawyer had provided. The interior smelled of mold and decay, decades of abandonment creating an atmosphere that felt heavy and oppressive, but Gracelyn had dealt with worse properties in her work as a real estate investor, and she moved through the ground floor with professional detachment, taking notes on damage and making mental calculations about renovation costs. The first floor had housed the reception area and basic examination rooms, all of them stripped of equipment and furniture long ago, leaving just empty spaces with peeling linoleum and water-stained walls. The second floor had been for patient rooms, small spaces with remnants of built-in cabinets and ancient call buttons still mounted beside where beds would have stood. Gracelyn was making her way down the second-floor hallway when she saw the first figure in the window, just a glimpse of someone standing in one of the rooms, watching her pass, and her heart rate spiked before logic kicked in and reminded her that old buildings created optical illusions, that reflections and shadows played tricks on perception. She doubled back to check the room and found it empty, no figure, and no indication anyone had been there, and she continued her inspection, telling herself that jumpiness was natural when you were alone in a creepy abandoned building. The third floor had been the surgical suite and the doctor's offices, and this was where Gracelyn found the first real evidence that something was wrong with this building beyond simple neglect and decay. One of the offices still had furniture in it, a desk and filing cabinets and bookshelves, all covered in dust but otherwise intact, as though whoever had occupied this space had simply walked out one day and never returned. Gracelyn checked the nameplate on the desk and found it engraved with Dr. Richard Vance, Chief Medical Officer, and something about that name triggered a memory from the paperwork her uncle's lawyer had provided. Dr. Vance had been the company doctor during the hospital's final decades of operation, and there had been some kind of scandal associated with him, something her uncle had mentioned in notes about the property's history. Gracelyn pulled out her phone to search for information but found she had no signal, the thick brick walls and remote location combining to create a dead zone. So she started going through the desk drawers, looking for anything that might give her context about the building's past. What she found in the bottom drawer made her skin crawl, a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten notes and precise medical terminology. Entries dating from 1968 through 1981 documenting procedures and experiments that couldn't possibly have been legal or ethical. Dr. Vance had been conducting unauthorized research on miners who came to him with injuries, using their vulnerability and the company's protection to perform procedures that went far beyond necessary treatment. He'd been testing pain thresholds, documenting how long men could remain conscious during operations without anesthesia, exploring the effects of various pharmaceutical combinations on healing rates and cognitive function. The journal entries were clinical and detached, describing human suffering with the same tone someone might use to record data about laboratory rats. And Gracelyn felt nausea rising as she read about procedures performed without consent on men who'd trusted this doctor to heal them. The journal contained names and dates and detailed descriptions of what had been done, a catalog of medical torture that had continued for 13 years under the company's implicit approval because injured miners were considered expendable resources that might as well contribute to medical knowledge before they were discarded. Gracelyn was so absorbed in reading the journal that she didn't notice the light changing, didn't register that afternoon had shifted into evening until the room was dim enough that she had to use her phone's flashlight to read. That's when she heard the footsteps, slow and measured, coming down the hallway toward the office where she sat. She froze, the journal still open in her hands, and listened as the footsteps stopped just outside the door. A shadow fell across the threshold, backlit by light that shouldn't exist in an abandoned building with no electricity. And Gracelyn saw the silhouette of a man in a long coat, the kind doctors wore in old medical dramas, standing perfectly still as though waiting for something. She wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but her voice wouldn't cooperate, locked in her throat by fear. That was both rational and primal. The figure stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, and then moved on. The footsteps continuing down the hallway, accompanied by other sounds now. Voices speaking in low tones, and the squeak of wheels that might have been a gurney being pushed across tile floors. Gracelyn forced herself to move, to get up from the desk and approach the doorway carefully. And when she looked into the hallway, she saw them, figures dressed in medical clothing from decades past. Nurses and orderlies moving with purpose between rooms that should have been empty. And she could hear sounds coming from those rooms now, the sounds of a hospital in operation, equipment beeping and people moaning in pain and voices, calling out instructions in medical jargon. She was seeing the hospital as it had been, some kind of residual haunting playing out like a recording, and she should have run then, should have fled the building and never looked back. But she found herself drawn forward, following the figure in the doctor's coat as he entered one of the rooms. Gracelyn stood in the doorway and watched as the scene played out before her, translucent but visible, a man strapped to an examination table, and Dr. Vance standing over him with instruments that gleamed in light that came from nowhere. And she could hear the patient begging, pleading for the doctor to stop, explaining that he just needed his broken arm set, and asking why he was being restrained. The doctor's response was calm and educational, explaining that pain was a fascinating phenomenon that medical science didn't fully understand, and that the patient should be grateful to contribute to research that might benefit future generations. Gracelyn watched in horror as Dr. Vance proceeded with some kind of procedure on the fully conscious patient, documenting his responses with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. And the screaming that filled the room was so vivid and terrible that Gracelyn clapped her hands over her ears and stumbled backward. The vision faded like smoke, and she was alone in an empty room again, but the echo of those screams seemed to linger in the air, and Gracelyn understood with absolute certainty that this building wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed by the suffering that had occurred within its walls. She ran then, finally allowing her flight instinct to override her morbid curiosity, and she made it down 2 flights of stairs before realizing she'd left the journal in the office, and something about leaving that evidence behind felt wrong, felt like abandoning the victims a second time. She forced herself to go back up, her legs shaking and her breath coming in gasps, and she retrieved the journal from where she'd dropped it on the floor. As she was leaving the office, she saw him clearly for the first time, Dr. Richard Vance standing in the hallway, watching her, with eyes that held no warmth or humanity, and she realized he wasn't a residual haunting, wasn't just a recording playing in loop. He was aware, was conscious and present, and he was angry at her intrusion into his domain. Gracelyn ran again, and this time she didn't stop until she was in her car with the doors locked and the engine running. And even then she could see him in the third-floor window, watching her leave. His figure solid and real despite having died in 1982, according to the information she'd found in his journal. She drove straight to the Kentucky State Police post in Harlan, handed them the journal, and told them everything she'd found. And to her surprise, they didn't dismiss her story or treat her like she was crazy. They'd received reports about the hospital before, they explained, from urban explorers and local teenagers who'd broken in over the years. Reports of seeing figures in the windows and hearing screams echoing from empty rooms. The journal Gracelyn provided became evidence in what the state police called a historical investigation, an attempt to document crimes that had occurred too long ago for prosecution, but deserved acknowledgement nonetheless. They found records that confirmed everything Dr. Vance had written, found families of minors who'd suspected their loved ones had been subjected to unauthorized procedures, but had never been able to prove it, found evidence that the coal company had known what was happening and had protected Vance because his research was providing them with data about worker endurance and pain tolerance that helped them maximize productivity. The scandal made regional news, and Gracelyn donated the hospital building to a historical preservation society with the stipulation that it be turned into a memorial for the men who'd suffered there, a place where their names could be honored and their experiences acknowledged. But the building resisted renovation, the Historical Society reported, with workers refusing to enter after experiencing unexplained phenomena, tools going missing and then reappearing in strange locations, and the overwhelming sense of being watched by something hostile and unforgiving. The hospital stands empty still, a memorial that exists more in concept than in physical accessibility, because nobody can remain inside long enough to complete the renovations needed to make it safe for visitors. Gracelyn tried to visit once, 2 years after she'd inherited the property, wanting to see what progress had been made, and she found the building exactly as she'd left it. No work completed, and the third-floor window still showing a figure watching, the same figure in the doctor's coat that had stood in the hallway. She never went back after that, but she thinks about those miners sometimes, about men who'd gone to a doctor seeking help and received torture instead. And she thinks about Dr. Vance still walking those halls, still conducting his observations, still documenting responses to pain in a hospital that will never truly be empty because suffering of that magnitude leaves marks that time can't erase. The most recent report from Lynch, just last month, came from a state inspector checking the building's structural integrity, and he reported seeing examination rooms on the third floor that appeared to be in use, medical equipment that looked contemporary despite the building having no electricity, and the sound of someone screaming that cut off abruptly when he tried to investigate. Some ghosts aren't just memories, they're active presences that continue their work even after death. And Dr. Richard Vance remains in his hospital, conducting his research on an endless supply of patients who can never truly die because their suffering has become so embedded in the building's foundation that it plays out eternally. For the Verified Souls family, this story reminds us that the worst monsters aren't always supernatural. Sometimes they're humans given authority over vulnerable people and the moral flexibility to abuse that authority in the name of science, or progress, or company profit. And the echoes of their actions haunt not just buildings, but our collective conscience, demanding we remember, so that such atrocities are never repeated in the forgotten places where oversight fails and human life becomes expendable. Carolina had been driving truck routes through southwestern Virginia for 7 years, knew every mountain pass and shortcut in the region, and prided herself on never letting superstition interfere with efficiency or profit. When the dispatcher offered her a route that would take her through Pocahontas, with a bonus for overnight delivery, She accepted without hesitation despite the warning from another driver in the break room, who'd muttered something about the tunnel and fog and sounds that weren't natural. Carolina dismissed the warning as the kind of tall tale truckers told to haze newcomers, packed her thermos and overnight bag, and hit the road just as the sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains. The route was straightforward until she reached Pocahontas, a town that existed now more as a historical marker than an actual community. Its glory days as a coal hub long past, and its current population barely enough to justify keeping the post office open. The railroad tunnel the other driver had mentioned was part of the old main line, built in the 1880s to transport coal from the mines to markets in the east, and Carolina's route took her on a road that ran parallel to the tracks for about 3 miles, before veering off toward her destination. She was passing the tunnel entrance right around dusk, that transitional time when light becomes uncertain and shadows grow ambitious, when the fog rolled in with a speed that seemed unnatural even for mountain weather. One moment Carolina had clear visibility, the next moment she was driving through soup, so thick her headlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead, and she had to slow to a crawl to avoid running off the road. That's when she heard it, a sound that cut through the fog and the rumble of her truck's engine, a human scream so filled with terror and agony that it made her stomp on the brakes instinctively. The truck shuddered to a stop, and Carolina sat there with her heart pounding, listening as the scream continued, not fading, but maintaining steady volume as though whoever was producing it had infinite lung capacity and infinite reason to keep screaming. She grabbed her phone to call for help, to report what had to be someone in terrible distress, but the fog seemed to interfere with the signal, her phone showing bars that flickered and died and reappeared in random patterns. The screaming came from the direction of the tunnel, echoing in ways that made it impossible to pinpoint exact location, and Carolina faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. Drive on and pretend she'd heard nothing, or investigate and potentially help someone who desperately needed it. She chose investigation because Carolina had been raised to believe that you didn't ignore people in distress, and she pulled her truck onto the shoulder and grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight she kept behind the seat. The walk to the tunnel entrance took less than 5 minutes but felt longer, the fog pressing against her like something with weight and intention. And the screaming continued without pause or variation, just endless terror that made Carolina's hands shake and her stomach clench with sympathetic fear. The tunnel entrance loomed out of the fog like a mouth, the old brick archway still solid despite more than a century of exposure to weather, and Carolina could see the rails disappearing into darkness that her flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. The screaming was definitely coming from inside the tunnel, echoing off the walls and creating harmonics that made it sound like multiple voices, and Carolina stood at the entrance, trying to convince herself to go in, while every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run back to her truck and drive away as fast as possible. She compromised, calling out into the darkness, asking if anyone needed help, offering assistance, and the screaming stopped so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical blow. The silence lasted maybe 10 seconds, long enough for Carolina to convince herself that whoever had been screaming had heard her and was coming toward her. And then a voice spoke from the darkness, male and rough, and speaking with an accent that sounded wrong, outdated in ways she couldn't quite identify. The voice asked for water, begged for it actually, said they'd been working for 18 hours without break, and the heat in the tunnel was unbearable, and please, could she bring water? Carolina felt relief wash over her, because this made sense. There must be maintenance workers in the tunnel who'd gotten in trouble somehow, and she called back that she had water in her truck and would bring it. She turned to head back, and that's when she heard the other sound starting, pickaxes striking stone, and voices calling to each other in that same outdated accent, the sounds of men working, and Carolina's relief curdled into confusion because it was nearly 8 at night, and no maintenance crew worked in the dark without lights, and she hadn't seen any equipment or vehicles that would indicate an active work site. She swept her flashlight across the tunnel entrance and saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, men wearing clothes that belonged in historical photographs, carrying tools that hadn't been used in decades, and their faces were wrong. Not in any specific way she could articulate, but in a fundamental wrongness that made her brain reject what her eyes were seeing. Carolina ran, her flashlight beam wild and useless, bouncing off fog and pavement as she fled back to her truck. She could hear footsteps behind her, multiple sets keeping pace with her sprint, and voices calling out, asking why she was running, saying they just needed water, saying the foreman wouldn't let them stop until the work was done. She made it to her truck and threw herself into the cab, locked the doors with shaking hands, and looked in her side mirror to see them standing on the road behind her. Maybe a dozen, men in work clothes from another century, and they were watching her with expressions that held no comprehension of why she was afraid. Carolina started the engine and pulled back onto the road, accelerating despite the fog, and she kept checking her mirrors, expecting to see the figures following. But they just stood there watching until the fog swallowed them, and she couldn't see anything but white mist. She drove until she was well past Pocahontas, didn't stop until she reached a truck stop 30 miles up the road, and she sat in the parking lot under bright fluorescent lights, trying to process what she'd experienced. The waitress who served her coffee around midnight listened to Carolina's story with the patient expression of someone who'd heard it before, and when Carolina finished, the waitress confirmed what she'd already begun to suspect. The tunnel outside Pocahontas was haunted, had been for as long as anyone could remember, by the men who died during its construction in 1882. They'd been convict laborers, criminals sentenced to hard labor, who'd been worked to death in the tunnel under conditions that would have been criminal, even by the standards of the time. A section of the tunnel had collapsed during construction, trapping 17 men, and the railroad company's foreman had made the decision to continue construction rather than attempt a rescue that would delay the project. The trapped men had been buried alive, and rather than excavating their bodies, the company had simply built over them, sealing them into the tunnel's foundation, where they remain to this day. The screaming started about a week after the collapse, locals reported, and it had continued ever since, always around dusk on foggy evenings. Always the same pattern of one voice screaming, and then multiple voices calling out for water or begging to be let out. People who investigated, like Carolina had, reported seeing the workers and hearing them ask for help, and some people claimed to have actually entered the tunnel trying to find the source, but nobody who went in ever found anything except darkness and echoes and a growing sense that they were being followed by something that wanted them to stay. Carolina completed her delivery the next morning after sleeping fitfully in her truck's sleeper cab, and when she returned to the depot, she told the dispatcher she wouldn't be taking any more routes that went through Pocahontas, regardless of the bonus offered. The dispatcher didn't argue, just made a note in the system, and Carolina learned later that there was an unofficial list of drivers who refused that route, enough that the company had stopped even asking some people, and just assigned it to newcomers or drivers desperate enough for the extra money to ignore the warnings. She tried to report what she'd seen to the Virginia State Police, thinking there should be some kind of historical acknowledgement or memorial for those convict laborers who died in the tunnel. But the officer who took her statement explained that the railroad company's records from that era were incomplete at best and deliberately falsified at worst, that there was no proof the collapse had ever happened beyond local folklore, and that attempting to excavate the tunnel to search for remains would be prohibitively expensive and dangerous given the structure's age. The screaming continued, the officer said, and people continued to investigate it. And every few years, someone would start a petition to properly memorialize the dead workers. But nothing ever came of it, because proving what had happened required evidence that had been deliberately destroyed by men who'd valued railroad schedules over human lives. Carolina changed routes entirely after that, started working exclusively in eastern Virginia, where the terrain was flat and the history was different, and she didn't drive through the mountains at all if she could avoid it. But she thought about those men sometimes, about workers who'd been convicted of crimes and sentenced to labor that killed them, about a foreman who'd chosen productivity over rescue, about bodies still sealed in the tunnel's foundation, screaming through time for water and mercy that would never come. She'd read about the convict lease system after her experience, learned about how southern states had essentially continued slavery under a different name by sentencing mostly black men to hard labor and then leasing them to companies that worked them to death with no accountability or oversight. The men in the Pocahontas tunnel might have been guilty of actual crimes or might have been convicted on pretexts, but either way, they deserved better than being buried alive and forgotten, deserved better than having their suffering dismissed as folklore and their deaths going unacknowledged by any official record. The tunnel still stands, still carries occasional freight trains, and the screaming still happens on foggy evenings around dusk. A reminder that some injustices echo through time, demanding acknowledgement even when the society that created them would prefer to forget. A historical researcher contacted Carolina 2 years after her experience, working on a book about convict labor in Appalachian railroad construction, and she told him everything she'd experienced. The researcher shared information he'd uncovered in private letters and diaries from people who'd worked for the railroad company, confirming that the collapse had happened and that the decision to seal the workers in had been made by a foreman named Elias Marsh, who'd later been promoted for bringing the project in under budget and ahead of schedule. Marsh had died wealthy and respected in 1924, his gravestone in Richmond describing him as a railroad pioneer and civic leader, with no mention of the 17 men whose deaths had contributed to his success. The researcher asked if Carolina would be willing to testify if he could generate enough evidence to petition for a historical marker at the tunnel, and she agreed immediately because she'd heard those men screaming and she'd seen them asking for water, and they deserved to have their story told even if it came 140 years too late. The marker was finally installed last year, a bronze plaque near the tunnel entrance acknowledging the convict laborers who died during construction and naming the 17 men who'd been sealed inside when the section collapsed, names the researcher had painstakingly reconstructed from court records and prison manifests. Carolina attended the dedication ceremony, along with descendants of some of the dead workers and local historians, and a representative from the railroad company offering an official apology for actions taken by their predecessors. The screaming still happens, locals report, unchanged by the acknowledgement and the apology and the marker, because some wounds don't heal even when they're finally recognized. But Carolina feels like she did the right thing by not driving past that night, by investigating even though it terrified her, by being a witness to suffering that everyone else had tried to forget. The verified soul's family needs to understand that the scariest ghosts aren't always supernatural threats. Sometimes they're reminders of real human cruelty, of decisions made by people in power to value profit and efficiency over human life. And those ghosts keep screaming not because they want to frighten us, but because they refuse to let us forget that they existed, that they suffered, and that they deserved better than being buried in unmarked graves and written out of history by men who saw them as nothing more than expendable labor in the service of progress that ground them to dust beneath its wheels. Arleth moved to Dante in the spring of 2019, taking a job as a traveling nurse at the small clinic that served the remaining residents of what had once been a thriving coal town. The pay was decent, and the work was meaningful, providing health care to a population that had been largely forgotten by the rest of Virginia. And Arleth liked the idea of making a difference in a community that desperately needed medical professionals willing to work in rural Appalachia. The town itself was depressing in the way that dying places always are. More empty buildings than occupied ones, more memories than futures. But the people were kind and grateful for her presence, and Arleth settled into a routine that felt purposeful if not exactly exciting. She rented a small house on the edge of town, a place with a porch that looked out toward the mountains and enough space for the garden she'd always wanted to plant. And she started learning the rhythms of life in Dante, the unspoken rules and local customs that defined a community that had been left behind by economic forces beyond its control. It was during her third week there, driving home from a late shift at the clinic around dusk, that she encountered the smiling woman for the first time. The woman was standing on the side of the road about 2 miles from town, clearly visible in Arleth's headlights, wearing a dress that looked like it might have been nice once but was now faded and dirty. What struck Arleth immediately was the woman's smile, unnaturally wide and fixed, the kind of expression that looked more like a grimace than genuine happiness, and the way she stood perfectly still with her thumb out in the universal gesture of hitchhiking. Arleth's first instinct was to stop, to help someone who appeared to need assistance, but something about that smile made her hesitate, made her hands tighten on the steering wheel and her foot press a little harder on the accelerator. She drove past, watching in her rearview mirror as the woman turned to watch her go, that terrible smile never faltering, and Arleth felt a wave of guilt mixed with relief. She told herself she'd send someone back to check, would call the county sheriff to report a stranded motorist, but by the time she got home, the urgency had faded, and she'd convinced herself that the woman had probably been picked up by another driver or had found her own way to wherever she was going. The smiling woman appeared again 3 nights later, in a different location, but with the same pose and the same unsettling smile, and this time Arleth was prepared to stop, had talked herself into being a good Samaritan despite her unease. But as she slowed down and pulled toward the shoulder, the woman's smile grew impossibly wider, stretching her face in ways that violated basic anatomy, and Arleth saw that her eyes weren't quite right, reflecting her headlights with a shine that looked more animal than human. Arleth accelerated again, her heart hammering, and in her mirror, she saw the woman take a step toward her departing vehicle, still smiling, still watching, and Arleth drove faster than she should have on the winding mountain road, desperate to put distance between herself and whatever she'd just encountered. At the clinic the next day, she mentioned the hitchhiker to Salem, one of the medical assistants who'd lived in Dante her entire life, and Salem's face went pale in a way that made Arleth's stomach drop. Salem explained in a quiet voice that everyone in Dante knew about the smiling woman, had known about her for decades, and the most important rule was that you never, ever stop to pick her up, no matter how much your conscience insisted you should help. The smiling woman had been appearing on Dante's road since 1944, Salem explained, always at dusk, always hitchhiking, always wearing that same faded dress and displaying that same terrible smile. The local legend said she'd been a worker at the munitions plant that operated outside Dante during World War II, one of the dozens of women who'd taken factory jobs when the men went overseas to fight. The plant had exploded in November of 1944, a catastrophic industrial accident that killed 37 women and injured dozens more, and the bodies had been so badly damaged by the explosion and resulting fire that many couldn't be identified. The woman had been buried in a mass grave with the other unidentified victims, and she'd started appearing on the roads shortly after, always asking for a ride home from the plant, always smiling that horrible smile that suggested something had broken in her that went beyond physical damage. The few people who'd been foolish enough or kind enough to stop and pick her up over the years had reported the same experience. She'd get in the car and sit in silence for a few minutes, still smiling, and then she'd mention that she was heading home from the plant, that it had been a long shift and she was tired, and as she talked, her appearance would change, burns becoming visible on her skin, her dress showing scorch marks, and that smile would reveal teeth blackened by smoke and heat. The people who'd picked her up said the smell was the worst part, the acrid stench of burning that filled the car and wouldn't dissipate even after she'd vanished, 'cause she always vanished eventually, usually fading away mid-sentence, or disappearing when the driver looked away for a moment to check the road. The smell would linger in the vehicle for weeks, and the drivers would report nightmares afterward, dreams of being trapped in burning buildings and unable to find exits, waking up gasping and smelling smoke that wasn't there. Most disturbing were the reports from drivers who'd ask the woman her name, trying to make conversation, or maybe hoping to identify her so her family could know what happened to her. She'd tell them her name was Mary, or Elizabeth, or Catherine, or any one of a dozen names that appeared on the list of unidentified victims from the explosion, as though she contained all of them somehow, as though the mass grave had merged their identities into a single entity that couldn't rest because it didn't know who it was supposed to be. Salem told Arleth that the standing policy in Dante was to acknowledge the smiling woman if you saw her, maybe a wave or a nod, but never to stop, never to offer help, because helping her meant inviting her trauma into your vehicle and your life and your dreams. Arleth saw the smiling woman 7 more times over the next 6 months, always at dusk, always on different stretches of road around Dante, and each time Arleth would wave politely and keep driving, fighting the guilt that came from deliberately refusing to help someone who appeared to need it. The woman would always watch her pass, that smile never changing, and Arleth would check her rear-view mirror compulsively for the next mile, half expecting to see the figure in her back seat despite never having stopped to pick her up. The encounters started affecting Arleth's sleep, not nightmares exactly, but an unease that made rest difficult, a sense of being watched even in her own home that she couldn't shake. She started researching the 1944 explosion, spending evenings in the county library, going through newspaper archives and accident reports, trying to understand what had happened and why this particular tragedy had created a haunting that lasted 75 years. What she found was a story of negligence and cover-up that made the smiling woman's eternal hitchhiking feel less like supernatural horror and more like justified rage at being forgotten. The munitions plant had been operating with inadequate safety measures, cutting corners to meet wartime production demands, and multiple workers had filed complaints about dangerous conditions in the weeks leading up to the explosion. Those complaints had been ignored or dismissed, with managers prioritizing output over safety and threatening workers who pushed back with termination at a time when good jobs were scarce. The explosion had been caused by a malfunction that multiple engineers had warned about, a problem that could have been fixed with proper maintenance but that the plant operators had deemed too expensive and time-consuming to address. When the disaster happened, the company had been quick to blame worker error rather than systemic negligence, and the investigation had been rushed and superficial, conclusions reached before evidence could properly contradict the preferred narrative. The 37 women who died had been painted as careless or incompetent, their deaths treated as acceptable losses in service of the war effort, and the unidentified victims had been buried quickly without serious attempts at identification, because dealing with grieving families, asking difficult questions was inconvenient for a company trying to minimize liability and resume operations. Arleth became somewhat obsessed with the story, tracking down descendants of the identified victims and trying to piece together which of the unidentified women might have been who. She found photographs of the workers, groups of women in their work clothes standing in front of the plant, looking tired but proud, contributing to the war effort and earning wages that gave them independence their mothers had never known. She found letters some of them had written to family members, talking about the work and the friendships they'd formed, and the lives they were planning after the war ended. These women had been real people with futures and dreams, and they'd been erased by an explosion and a company more interested in protecting its reputation than honoring their memory. The mass grave where the unidentified victims were buried had a simple marker that listed the number of dead but no names, and Arleth started a project to change that, reaching out to historical societies and genealogical researchers to see if modern forensic techniques might be able to identify the remains and give each woman her name back. The project took 2 years and involved DNA testing, dental records, and painstaking reconstruction of who had been working which shift on the day of the explosion. Arleth coordinated with families and researchers, and even the company that had operated the plant, though their cooperation was grudging and came with lawyers insisting on liability releases. In the end, they were able to identify 11 of the 13 previously unidentified victims, women whose names could finally be added to the memorial and whose families could finally have closure after 77 years. The dedication ceremony for the new memorial happened on a rainy afternoon in November 2021, with descendants and local residents and Arleth standing around the mass grave while a minister spoke about justice, delayed but not denied, about remembering the forgotten, about giving names back to women who'd been reduced to numbers. Arleth cried during the ceremony, overwhelmed by the weight of all those years and all that unnecessary suffering, and she placed flowers on the grave marker while reading each newly identified name aloud. She saw the smiling woman one more time, 3 days after the memorial dedication, standing on the side of the road at dusk in the same location where Arleth had first encountered her. But this time was different. The smile was still there, but softer somehow, less terrible, and when Arleth slowed down, the woman didn't make the hitchhiking gesture, but simply raised her hand in what looked like a wave, acknowledgement rather than request. Arleth waved back, and the woman's smile became something that looked almost peaceful, and then she faded away like morning mist, not vanishing abruptly, but dissolving gradually until she was gone. Arleth pulled over and sat there crying for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, some mixture of grief and relief and the bone-deep satisfaction of knowing she'd done something that mattered. The smiling woman hasn't been seen since that night, according to Salem and the other longtime residents Arleth asked, though people still drive cautiously at dusk on the roads around Dante just in case, old habits dying hard even after the reason for them has resolved. Arleth still works at the clinic in Dante, still lives in that house on the edge of town, and she tends the memorial grave site now, making sure there are always fresh flowers and that the names remain legible on the marker. She thinks about those 37 women sometimes, about how they died serving their country in their own way and had been thanked with negligence and anonymity. And she thinks about how the smiling woman had hitchhiked for 75 years, not because she wanted to frighten people, but because she'd been trying to get home, trying to be remembered, trying to reclaim the identity that had been taken from her by an explosion and a company that couldn't be bothered to learn her name. The Verified Souls family should remember that the most persistent hauntings often come from the most profound injustices, that ghosts are frequently just people demanding the acknowledgement they were denied in life. And sometimes the only way to put a spirit to rest is to do the work that should have been done from the beginning. Remember their names, tell their stories, and ensure that convenience and profit never again matter more than human dignity and the simple right to be identified when you die. Salem moved to Wilder in the summer of 2003, a recent college graduate taking a position as a wildlife biologist with the state's Department of Natural Resources, and she'd been specifically assigned to investigate reports of unusual animal mortality patterns in the forested areas surrounding the small mountain community. The reports had been coming in for months from hunters and hikers who discovered piles of animal bones arranged in patterns that didn't match any known predator behavior. Deer skeletons positioned in circles with the skulls facing inward. Smaller animals like rabbits and squirrels arranged in spirals. And in one particularly disturbing case, dozens of bird skeletons hanging from tree branches like macabre wind chimes. The department suspected some kind of cult activity or bored teenagers with too much time and too little supervision, but they needed documentation and evidence before involving law enforcement. So Salem was tasked with surveying the area, photographing the bone arrangements, and determining if there was any ecological explanation for what appeared to be deliberate human interference with wildlife remains. She arrived in Wilder with her field equipment and her scientific skepticism intact, ready to solve what was probably a simple case of rural boredom manifesting as creepy art projects. The town itself was barely a town by any reasonable definition. Maybe 40 permanent residents scattered across a hollow so remote that cell service was non-existent, and the nearest grocery store required a 40-minute drive on roads that became impassable in winter. The people were friendly but guarded, the way isolated communities always are with outsiders, and when Salem mentioned why she was there, she noticed a shift in the friendliness, a pulling back that suggested she'd touched on something the locals preferred not to discuss. The woman who ran the general store, elderly and sharp-eyed, told Salem she'd be better off leaving the bones alone, that some things in these mountains had their own business that didn't concern wildlife biologists or anyone else from outside. Salem thanked her for the advice and ignored it completely, because she had a job to do and a career to build, and local superstition wasn't going to deter her from proper scientific investigation. She spent her first week in Wilder hiking the surrounding forest, GPS unit and camera in hand, documenting every bone pile she could find, and what she discovered was disturbing not because it was supernatural, but because the patterns were so consistent and so elaborate that they suggested someone had been doing this for a very long time with increasing sophistication. The arrangements showed evolution in complexity, starting with simple circles and lines that Salem found in areas the locals said had first shown bone piles 40 years ago, progressing to more intricate geometric patterns and symbolic arrangements that suggested either artistic development or growing obsession. Salem photographed everything, took samples for age dating, and mapped the locations, and what emerged from her data was a timeline spanning 4 decades and covering approximately 15 square miles of forest. Whoever was doing this had been incredibly active and incredibly dedicated, spending what must have been countless hours collecting bones and arranging them in increasingly remote locations. Salem's professional opinion, which she documented in her preliminary report, was that this was the work of a single individual, likely someone local who knew these woods intimately and who had been engaging in this behavior since at least the 1960s. The question was who and why, and whether they posed any danger beyond making hikers uncomfortable and disturbing ecological research data. Salem decided to set up trail cameras at several of the more recently created bone pile locations, motion-activated equipment that would photograph anything that passed by, and she checked them weekly, expecting to eventually capture images of whoever was responsible. The first 3 weeks yielded nothing useful, just photographs of deer and raccoons and the occasional black bear, normal forest activity that didn't explain the bone arrangements. But the 4th week's images made Salem's hands shake as she reviewed them on her laptop in the cabin she'd rented. The camera positioned at the largest bone pile, an elaborate spiral of deer skeletons that must have taken weeks to create, had captured a figure moving through the frame at 3 a.m. The figure was human-shaped, but moved wrong, with a gait that suggested either severe injury or something fundamentally inhuman, and it was carrying what looked like bones, adding to the arrangement with methodical precision. Salem zoomed in on the clearest image and felt her scientific rationalism collide with visceral horror, because the figure matched the description of someone who was supposed to be dead. His name was Ezekiel Marsh, according to the local history Salem dug up after seeing those trail camera images, and he'd been a hermit who'd lived in the mountains outside Wilder from the 1940s until 1968, when locals assumed he'd died because they stopped seeing him in town picking up supplies. Ezekiel had been strange even by the standards of mountain eccentrics, a man who claimed to hear voices from the animals he hunted and who developed increasingly elaborate rituals around the processing of game. Local hunters from that era remembered him arranging bones in his yard, creating patterns he said honored the spirits of the animals and ensured good hunting. And children had been forbidden from going near his property after several kids who'd ventured too close reported seeing things hanging from his trees that looked disturbingly human-shaped, even though Ezekiel insisted they were just unusually large raccoons. In 1964, 2 children went missing from Wilder, a brother and sister who'd been playing in the woods and never came home, and suspicion had immediately fallen on Ezekiel. Searchers had found bone piles near his property, and while none of the bones were human, the arrangements were disturbing enough that the sheriff brought Ezekiel in for questioning. He'd been released due to lack of evidence and the children were never found, but the community had essentially driven him out, making it clear he wasn't welcome in town and cutting off his access to supplies. Locals assumed he'd died in the mountains sometime in the late 60s. His body never recovered. Just another hermit who'd met his end alone in the wilderness. But Salem's trail camera had captured someone matching Ezekiel's description 55 years after he was supposed to have died, still collecting bones and creating arrangements, and the implications of that made Salem question either the historical records or her own sanity. She decided to stake out one of the bone pile locations herself, to see with her own eyes what the cameras were capturing, and she chose a night with a full moon that would provide enough light to see by without needing artificial illumination that might scare off whoever or whatever was creating the arrangements. She positioned herself in a deer blind about 30 yards from a bone pile that her cameras showed frequent activity. Armed with binoculars and her phone set to silent, and she waited as the temperature dropped and the forest sounds shifted to their nocturnal rhythms. Around 2 in the morning, she heard movement, footsteps that were irregular and dragging, and the figure emerged from the tree line carrying what looked like a deer skull, still attached to part of the spine. Salem watched through her binoculars as the figure added the bones to the existing pile, arranging them with care that suggested ritual significance, and she could see his face clearly in the moonlight, weathered beyond natural aging, skin like dried leather pulled tight over prominent bones, and eyes that reflected moonlight with an animal shine. He was humming while he worked, a tuneless sound that raised goosebumps on Salem's arms, and when he finished arranging the bones, he stood there for several minutes just staring at his creation, head tilted, as though listening to something Salem couldn't hear. She stayed frozen in the deer blind, hardly breathing, and watched as he finally turned and walked back into the forest with that same dragging gait, and only after he'd been gone for a full 10 minutes did she allow herself to move. She climbed down from the blind on shaking legs and approached the newly modified bone pile, and in the moonlight she could see that he'd arranged the deer skull and spine to form what looked like an arrow pointing deeper into the forest, toward an area Salem hadn't yet explored. Salem followed the arrow's direction the next day, hiking into a section of forest so remote that her GPS had trouble maintaining satellite lock, and what she found there made her understand why the locals had told her to leave the bones alone. There was a clearing hidden in a hollow where the trees grew thick and the sunlight barely penetrated, and the clearing was filled with bone arrangements on a scale that dwarfed anything Salem had seen before. Hundreds of animal skeletons formed concentric circles around a central structure, and as Salem got closer, she realized the central structure was a shelter built entirely from bones, a framework of larger animal skeletons covered with smaller bones woven together like macabre wicker. The smell was overwhelming, death and decay and something else, something chemical that Salem's brain identified as formaldehyde, even though that made no sense this deep in the woods. She circled the bone shelter, photographing everything with mounting dread, and that's when she found the small skeletons arranged at what served as the shelter's entrance. They were human, child-sized, positioned to look like they were guarding the entrance, or perhaps trying to escape from it, and Salem felt bile rise in her throat as she realized what she was looking at. The 2 children who'd gone missing in 1964, their remains finally found after nearly 40 years, arranged like trophies or warnings or prayers, depending on how you interpreted Ezekiel's disturbed psychology. Salem backed away from the shelter, her professional objectivity completely shattered, and she was pulling out her satellite phone to call for law enforcement when she heard the dragging footsteps behind her. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her with those animal-shine eyes, and Salem could see now that he wasn't just elderly. He was wrong in fundamental ways, his proportions slightly off, and his movements suggesting joints that bent in directions human joints shouldn't bend. He spoke in a voice like gravel scraping stone, asking if she appreciated his work, explaining that the animals told him where to place their bones after they died, that he was honoring them, giving them purpose beyond just feeding scavengers and returning to the earth. Salem ran, crashing through undergrowth and fallen branches, her only thought to get away from the clearing and the bone shelter, and the man who couldn't possibly still be alive but somehow was. She heard him following, those dragging footsteps maintaining steady pace behind her, and she realized with horror that he was hurting her, driving her in a specific direction rather than actually trying to catch her. She burst out of the tree line onto a dirt road and nearly collided with a pickup truck, the driver slamming on brakes and jumping out, asking if she was okay. Salem gasped out that someone was chasing her, pointed back toward the forest. And the driver, a local man she recognized from the general store, went pale and told her to get in the truck immediately. As they drove away, Salem looked back and saw Ezekiel standing at the tree line, still, watching, and the driver explained in a quiet voice that everyone in Wilder knew Ezekiel was still in those mountains, that he'd stopped being fully human sometime in the 60s, after whatever he'd done to those children, that the forest had claimed him somehow and wouldn't let him die or leave. The authorities excavated the bone shelter and recovered the remains of the 2 missing children, finally giving their families closure after 39 years. And they searched for Ezekiel Marsh, but found no trace beyond his bone arrangements and that shelter built from death. Salem left Wilder 2 days after the discovery, requested transfer to a different region, and never worked in isolated mountain communities again because she learned that some people don't just live in the wilderness. They become part of it. And when someone crosses certain lines and violates certain taboos, the forest sometimes absorbs them, keeps them, and won't let them go until their purpose is fulfilled or their madness finally burns out. The bone piles still appear in the forest around Wilder, locals report, though less frequently than before, as though Ezekiel is finally winding down after 40 years of honoring the dead in the only way his broken mind understands. For the verified Souls family, this story serves as a reminder that the scariest monsters are the ones who started as humans, who made choices that took them beyond the boundaries of humanity and into something else entirely. And sometimes the wilderness doesn't judge those transformations. It just accepts them and provides space for obsessions to play out across decades in forests too deep for anyone to interfere, until someone like Salem wanders in and discovers that some collectors never stop collecting, even after death should have claimed them. Anderson first heard about the frozen hollow from his grandfather, who'd worked the coal mines around Matewan in the 1970s, and still carried stories from those days like scars that never quite healed. The old man would sit on his porch during summer evenings when the West Virginia heat made the air thick enough to chew, and he'd talk about a place in the mountains where winter never left, where frost covered the ground even in August, and your breath came out in clouds regardless of the season. Anderson had always assumed these stories were exaggerations or metaphors, the way old miners talked about the cold that lived in their bones from years spent underground. But when he returned to Matewan in the fall of 2022 to settle his grandfather's estate after the old man finally passed, he learned that the frozen hollow was real, documented, and avoided by everyone who knew better. The lawyer handling the estate mentioned it almost casually while going over property boundaries, noting that Anderson's grandfather's land bordered the hollow and that he should stay away from that section, because the cold could be dangerous even to experienced outdoorsmen. And Anderson's curiosity, always his defining characteristic and frequent liability, immediately latched onto the mystery. He spent his first week in Matewan dealing with paperwork and sorting through his grandfather's belongings, finding photographs and union documents and medical records that told the story of a man who'd spent his life fighting for dignity in an industry that treated workers as expendable machinery. Among his grandfather's papers, Anderson found a journal from 1921, not written by his grandfather but by someone named Thomas Kane, and the journal's final entries were about the frozen hollow, about union organizers who'd been murdered there by company enforcers, about bodies dumped in an abandoned mine shaft that was never properly mapped or recorded. The entries described 12 men who'd been executed for trying to organize miners, shot, and thrown into the shaft like garbage. And Thomas Kane's final entry said he was going to the hollow to document the crime scene, to gather evidence that could be used to bring the company enforcers to justice. There were no entries after that date, and Anderson's research revealed that Thomas Kane had disappeared in March of 1921. His body never recovered. His fate officially listed as abandonment of family, even though everyone who knew him insisted he would never have left his wife and 3 children voluntarily. Anderson decided to find the frozen hollow to see if his grandfather's stories and Thomas Kane's journal were describing the same place, and he set out on a cool October morning with GPS coordinates calculated from descriptions in the journal and topographical maps of the area. The hike took him about 3 miles from his grandfather's property, following old mining roads that were barely visible under decades of reclaimed forest, and he knew he was getting close when the temperature started dropping noticeably, his breath suddenly visible, and the ground beneath his boots crunching with frost despite the morning sun. The transition was sharp and unnatural, like walking through an invisible barrier that separated normal autumn weather from deep winter. And within 20 yards, Anderson went from comfortable hiking temperature to cold that made his fingers numb and his face ache. The hollow itself was a depression in the mountainside, maybe 2 acres of flat ground surrounded by steep slopes, and every surface was covered in thick frost that sparkled in the sunlight like diamond dust. No plants grew in the hollow, no trees or undergrowth, just bare frozen earth and rocks coated in ice, and the silence was absolute, no birds or insects or wind, just Anderson's breathing and the crunch of his boots on frozen ground. He found the mine shaft near the center of the hollow, its entrance partially collapsed but still visible, a dark opening in the earth that exhaled cold air like a mouth breathing out winter. Anderson approached carefully, aware that old mine shafts were inherently dangerous, and he could see down into the darkness for maybe 10 feet before the shaft angled away or collapsed completely. The cold coming from the shaft was intense, colder than any natural cave system should produce, and Anderson felt it in his bones, felt it reaching into his chest and making his heart labor. He was backing away from the shaft, deciding this was too dangerous to investigate alone, when he heard the voices, faint and distant, but unmistakably human, coming from deep within the earth. They were calling for help, saying they were trapped, asking if anyone was up there, and Anderson felt his heart rate spike because the voices sounded fresh and immediate, not like echoes from a century ago, but like people currently in distress. He called down into the shaft, asking if anyone could hear him, and the voices responded with gratitude and desperation, begging him to get help, to bring rope and equipment, saying they'd been down there for hours, and the cold was unbearable. Anderson pulled out his phone to call for rescue services and found he had no signal, the hollow existing in a dead zone that his carrier couldn't penetrate. He made the decision to hike back to his truck, to drive to where he could get signal and call for emergency response, and he shouted down to the voices that he was going for help and would be back as soon as possible. The voices thanked him, told him to hurry because they were so cold, and Anderson ran back through the frozen hollow, his lungs burning with the frigid air, his mind focused on getting help as fast as possible. He made it back to his truck in record time, drove until his phone showed signal, and called 911 to report people trapped in a mine shaft. The dispatcher took his information and his location, and Anderson could hear the change in her tone when he mentioned the frozen hollow, a shift from professional urgency to something that sounded like concern mixed with pity. She told him to return to his grandfather's property and wait there, that responders would meet him, and when Anderson protested that people were trapped and dying from cold, the dispatcher told him gently that he needed to understand something about the frozen hollow before he went back there. The sheriff arrived at Anderson's grandfather's property within an hour, along with a deputy and a man the sheriff introduced as a historian from the local college who specialized in labor history and mining disasters. They sat on the porch, the same porch where Anderson's grandfather had told his stories, and they explained what Anderson had experienced. The voices from the shaft were real, they confirmed, heard by everyone who got close enough to the opening, and they'd been heard continuously since 1921. The mine shaft contained the bodies of 12 union organizers who'd been murdered by company enforcers during the labor conflicts that had torn Matewan apart, and the company had sealed them in that shaft specifically because it was remote and unlikely to be discovered. But something about the manner of their deaths, or the injustice of it, or perhaps just the particular geology of that location, had created a phenomenon that nobody could scientifically explain. The hollow had been freezing ever since the bodies were dumped there, maintaining winter temperatures year-round, and anyone who entered it heard the voices of the dying men calling for help that would never come. The phenomenon had been documented by researchers, investigated by paranormal teams, and discussed in academic papers, but no explanation had ever satisfied either scientific or supernatural frameworks. The historian showed Anderson photographs from various attempts to excavate the shaft, all of them abandoned because the cold became unbearable the deeper they dug, equipment malfunctioning, and workers becoming hypothermic even in summer. The bodies were still down there, the historian explained, frozen in the earth like extinct animals in permafrost, and the voices continued to call for help because on some level they were still experiencing their last moments, still believing rescue might come. Anderson felt sick listening to this, understanding that he'd heard men dying over and over, trapped in a loop of suffering that had lasted a century. The sheriff explained that locals had learned to avoid the hollow, that it was considered dangerous not because of any active threat, but because the cold could cause frostbite and hypothermia, and because hearing those voices affected people, made them obsessed with rescue attempts that couldn't succeed. Some people who'd heard the voices had tried repeatedly to reach the bodies, convinced they could save them, and a few had died in the attempt, succumbing to the cold or falling into unstable sections of the shaft while trying to dig deeper. Anderson asked why the bodies hadn't been recovered with modern equipment, why the state hadn't made this a priority given the historical significance and the ongoing disturbance. The historian's answer was complicated, involving property rights and competing claims about who was responsible and bureaucratic inertia that had stretched across decades. The company that had employed the enforcers was long defunct, absorbed into larger corporations that denied responsibility for actions taken by contractors a century ago. The land where the hollow existed had changed hands multiple times, and current owners refused access for excavation, citing liability concerns. Several unions had tried to organize recovery efforts, but funding was always insufficient, and official support was always just out of reach. The 12 men in that shaft had been abandoned by the system in 1921, and they remained abandoned in 2022, their voices still calling for help, while lawyers argued about jurisdiction and responsibility. Anderson felt rage building, the same rage his grandfather must have felt during his years fighting for miners' rights, and he declared his intention to make this his mission, to force someone to finally recover those bodies and give them proper burial. The next 3 months were consumed by Anderson's crusade, contacting media outlets and historical preservation groups and politicians who might care about century-old injustice. He found descendants of the 12 men, families who'd spent generations wondering what had happened to their grandfathers and great-grandfathers, and he helped them organize a coalition demanding action. He took journalists to the frozen hollow, let them experience the unnatural cold and hear the voices for themselves, and the resulting stories generated enough public pressure that the state finally allocated funding for a proper recovery operation. The excavation happened in January 2023. A team of specialists with cold weather equipment and ground-penetrating radar working carefully to reach the sealed shaft without disturbing the remains. Anderson was there when they finally broke through, when they found the 12 bodies exactly where Thomas Kane's journal had said they'd be, preserved by the cold and horrifying detail, frozen in positions that showed they'd been alive when they hit the bottom of the shaft, that some had survived the fall only to die slowly from injuries and cold, and the certain knowledge that nobody was coming to help them. The bodies were recovered with respect and ceremony, each man identified through dental records and personal effects and DNA comparison with living descendants, and they were finally given proper funerals with full honors, their names read aloud and their sacrifice for labor rights acknowledged by officials who hadn't wanted to deal with the complicated history but couldn't ignore it once the media was watching. Anderson attended all 12 funerals, met the descendants, and heard stories about the men who died fighting for fair wages and safe working conditions. Men who'd believed that workers deserved dignity and had paid for that belief with their lives. The frozen hollow began to thaw after the bodies were removed, the temperature rising gradually over the following weeks, until by spring it was indistinguishable from the surrounding forest, plants starting to grow in soil that had been frozen for a century. The voices stopped, locals reported, the mine shaft finally silent after 102 years of calling for help that had finally arrived. Anderson stayed in Matewan, couldn't bring himself to leave after seeing the project through, and he started working with local historical societies to document other forgotten injustices from the coal wars, other victims who'd been buried without acknowledgement. He thought about his grandfather often, understanding now why the old man had told those stories about the frozen hollow, why he'd kept Thomas Kane's journal instead of turning it over to authorities. His grandfather had known the system wouldn't act without pressure, that justice delayed indefinitely was justice denied, and he'd preserved the evidence, hoping someone would eventually use it. Anderson had become that someone, had finished work his grandfather couldn't complete, and the frozen hollow stood as proof that some crimes echo through time until they're finally addressed, that some cold goes bone deep and won't dissipate until the source is acknowledged and rectified. The verified soul's family needs to understand that the most persistent hauntings are often the most preventable, that voices keep calling because nobody wants to hear them, and sometimes the only way to warm a place that's been frozen by injustice is to finally do the work that should have been done from the beginning, to recover the dead, speak their names, and ensure their sacrifice isn't forgotten by people who'd rather bury uncomfortable history along with the bodies of those who fought for something better. Kyler had been backpacking through abandoned coal towns for a photography project documenting America's industrial decay, capturing images of places that capitalism had used up and discarded, and Nuttleburg represented exactly the kind of ghost town that told stories through its empty buildings and overgrown streets. The town had been completely abandoned since the 1950s, preserved as a historical site by the National Park Service, but left largely untouched. A snapshot of coal country frozen at the moment of its economic death. Kyler arrived on a Saturday morning in late September, hiking in from the nearest road with his camera equipment and camping gear, planning to spend the weekend exploring and photographing before hiking back out on Monday. The weather was perfect, clear skies and autumn temperatures, and the abandoned town looked almost peaceful in the morning light, buildings slowly being reclaimed by forest, and the new river flowing past like time itself, moving forward, while Nuttleberg remained stuck in 1958. Kyler spent the day methodically documenting structures, capturing the particular melancholy of empty houses where families had once lived and empty stores where communities had once gathered. And by evening, he'd set up his tent near what had once been the town's main street, far enough from the collapsing buildings to be safe but close enough to capture dawn light on the ruins. He was eating dinner around 7, reviewing the day's photographs on his camera, when he heard the bell, clear and loud, ringing in the pattern that churches use to call congregations to worship. Kyler looked up in surprise because he'd seen the church earlier, a small structure with its steeple still standing, but its bell tower empty, the bell itself long since removed or stolen, or simply fallen apart from decades of exposure. The ringing continued for maybe 2 minutes, a steady rhythm that echoed through the hollow, and then stopped as abruptly as it had started. Kyler told himself he'd heard echoes from another valley, sound traveling strangely through the mountains, but the explanation felt hollow even as he thought it. The silence that followed the bell was oppressive, the normal evening sounds of forest life noticeably absent, and Kyler felt unease creeping into his consciousness, the kind of primal awareness that comes from being alone in a place where something isn't quite right. He finished his dinner quickly and retreated into his tent, telling himself that ghost towns were creepy by nature, and his imagination was just filling the silence with meaning that wasn't there. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of bells and empty churches and shadows that moved wrong, and Kyler woke just before dawn to the sound of someone weeping. The crying was male, deep and broken, the sound of grief so profound it transcended time and circumstance, and it was coming from the direction of the church. Kyler lay in his sleeping bag, trying to decide if he was still dreaming, but the crying continued, punctuated by words he couldn't quite make out. And eventually curiosity overcame caution, and he unzipped his tent to investigate. The pre-dawn light was gray and uncertain, that liminal time when the world exists between darkness and day, and Kyler could see the church about 50 yards away, its white paint long since peeled away, but its basic structure still sound. The weeping was definitely coming from inside the church, and as Kyler approached, he could start to make out the words between sobs, a man's voice saying, "They're all gone," over and over, despair thick enough to feel like physical weight. Kyler reached the church's front door, which hung open on rusted hinges, and he could see inside to the main room, where rows of pews still stood facing the altar. A figure sat in the front pew, hunched over with his face in his hands, and the weeping came from him, ragged and raw. Kyler called out a greeting, asking if the person needed help, and the figure's head snapped up, revealing a face that was wrong in ways Kyler's brain struggled to process. The features were there, eyes and nose and mouth, but they were slightly off, proportions that suggested human but weren't quite right, and the expression of grief was so extreme it looked theatrical, exaggerated beyond what real human faces could display. The figure stared at Kyler for a long moment, and then spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming through water, asking if Kyler was there for the service, saying that nobody had come to church in so long, and he'd been ringing the bell every Sunday hoping someone would return. Kyler felt his mouth go dry, understanding that he wasn't talking to a living person, that he'd stumbled into something that defied every rational framework he'd built his worldview around. The figure stood, and Kyler could see now that he wore the black clothing of a preacher from decades past, formal attire that had been preserved perfectly despite the apparent age of everything else in this building. The preacher moved toward Kyler with a gait that suggested unfamiliarity with walking, and he extended his hand for a greeting, his smile stretching too wide, and his eyes reflecting the dawn light coming through the broken windows in a way that human eyes shouldn't. Kyler backed away instinctively, mumbling something about needing to check his campsite, and he turned and walked as fast as he could without running back toward his tent. Behind him, he heard the preacher calling out, saying that service started at 9 on Sundays, that everyone was welcome, that the congregation had been so faithful before they'd all left, and surely they'd want to return. Kyler didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the words, just focused on getting back to his tent and packing up and getting out of Nuttleburg before whatever he'd encountered decided to follow him. He broke camp with shaking hands, stuffing gear into his pack without his usual methodical organization, and he was rolling up his tent when he heard footsteps on the overgrown street, multiple sets approaching from different directions. Kyler looked up and saw them, figures emerging from the empty buildings, men and women and children dressed in clothing from the 1950s, all moving toward the church with the purposeful stride of people heading to Sunday service. They walked past Kyler without acknowledging him, their faces showing no expression, their eyes focused on the church. And Kyler counted maybe 40 of them, a full congregation appearing from nowhere in a town that had been empty for 70 years. He watched in frozen horror as they entered the church, filing into pews with the practiced ease of people who'd done this every week for years. And then the bell started ringing again, impossibly loud from a tower that held no bell. And the preacher's voice carried from inside the church, welcoming everyone and beginning a service that shouldn't exist. Kyler abandoned his tent and most of his gear, grabbed his camera and his pack with the essentials, and ran. He ran down the main street past empty buildings that had been lifeless 5 minutes ago, but now showed movement in windows. Shadows of people going about their daily routines in a town that had been dead since Eisenhower was president. He ran past the company store where he could hear voices discussing prices and gossip, past houses where he could smell cooking breakfast and hear children arguing, past the school where a bell rang, marking the start of a day that had ended decades ago. Nuttleburg was alive again, or something that resembled life was playing out in its empty structures, a recording of normalcy that Kyler's presence had somehow activated. He made it to the trail that led out of the town and didn't stop running until he'd put at least a mile between himself and the hollow, and only then did he allow himself to collapse on the trail, gasping and shaking, trying to process what he'd experienced. He made it back to his car by mid-morning, drove to the nearest town with cell service, and immediately started researching Nuttleburg's history, needing to understand what had happened there that could create what he'd witnessed. What he found was a story of slow death rather than dramatic disaster, a community that had withered as the coal played out and the company closed the mine, people leaving gradually over years until the last residents departed in 1958, and Nuttleburg became a ghost town officially rather than just functionally. But there was one notable tragedy, a footnote in most histories but apparently significant. The preacher of the town's church, a man named Reverend Samuel Hayes, had hanged himself from the bell tower in May of 1958, the week after the last family had moved away. He'd left a note saying he couldn't bear the death of his congregation, that a church without people was just a building, and a preacher without a congregation was nothing, and he'd rung the bell one final time before ending his life. His body had been found 3 days later by a state official checking on the abandoned town, and he'd been buried in the small cemetery on the hill behind the church, the last person interred in Nuttleburg. Kyler found photographs of Reverend Hayes, and the face matched the figure he'd seen in the church, confirming what he'd already suspected. He found accounts from park rangers and hikers who'd reported hearing church bells ringing in Nuttleburg on Sunday mornings, and a few reports from people who claimed to have seen figures in the abandoned buildings, though most of these accounts were dismissed as urban legend or misidentification. There was one detailed report from 1987, written by a historian who'd spent a night in Nuttleburg for research, and her account matched Kyler's experience almost exactly. Bells at dawn, a weeping preacher in the church, figures appearing and attending a service that shouldn't exist. She'd hypothesized that Reverend Hayes' suicide and the town's abandonment had created some kind of psychic imprint, a recording that played on loop, and that certain people under certain conditions could perceive it. Other researchers had tried to replicate her experience, but most reported nothing unusual, leading to speculation that sensitivity to the phenomenon was rare, or that it only manifested under specific circumstances that hadn't been identified. Kyler never recovered his tent, and the gear he'd left behind couldn't bring himself to return to Nuttleburg even in daylight with company. He contacted the National Park Service to report what he'd experienced and to warn them about his abandoned equipment, and the ranger he spoke with was sympathetic but unsurprised, mentioning that they found abandoned camping gear in Nuttleburg fairly regularly, left behind by people who'd had experiences they couldn't explain and didn't want to repeat. The Park Service had considered closing Nuttleburg to camping, but it was technically public land, and enforcing such a closure would be difficult. So instead, they'd just added warnings to the informational materials about the site being remote and potentially disorienting. Kyler asked if they knew about the phenomenon, about the bells and the preacher and the congregation that appeared on Sunday mornings, and the ranger admitted they'd had multiple reports over the years, but nothing they could officially acknowledge without evidence that would satisfy skeptics. Personal experiences weren't enough to warrant action, and the few photographs and recordings people had made showed nothing anomalous, as though the phenomenon resisted documentation. Kyler's own photographs from that morning were useless, showing empty buildings and normal abandonment with no trace of the congregation he'd seen, or the preacher who'd invited him to service. He tried to photograph them as they'd walked past him toward the church, he remembered, raising his camera and pressing the shutter, but the images showed only empty street and morning light. The phenomenon existed in perception rather than in reality. Or perhaps it existed in a reality that cameras couldn't capture, operating on wavelengths of existence that human consciousness could access, but technology couldn't record. Kyler finished his photography project focusing on other abandoned towns, and the images from Nuttleburg that he did include showed only the physical decay, the empty buildings and overgrown streets, with no hint of the life that still played out there on Sunday mornings when certain people were present to witness it. He sometimes thinks about Reverend Hayes still ringing that bell every week, still hoping his congregation will return, still conducting services for an audience of shadows and memories. And he wonders if the preacher knows he's dead or if he's trapped in a loop that feels completely real, repeating his final weeks endlessly without awareness that time has moved on and left him behind. The verified soul's family should understand that the saddest hauntings aren't always born from violence or injustice. Sometimes they come from love and loss and the refusal to accept that everything ends eventually. Reverend Hayes loved his congregation so much that losing them killed him, and his death didn't free him from that love, but trapped him in it, creating a ghost town that's haunted not by malevolence but by grief, so profound it bends reality around itself and pulls the living into witnessing a past that won't stay past. Some bells keep ringing because the person pulling the rope can't accept that nobody's coming to hear them, and some churches stay full because the preacher at the pulpit refuses to acknowledge that the pews are empty. And in places like Nuttleburg, where the physical world has been abandoned, the emotional world sometimes persists, sustained by feelings too intense to die when the person feeling them does. Onyx inherited the property from a distant aunt he'd never met, a woman who'd apparently been following his music career from afar and decided in her final years that he was the family member most likely to appreciate what she was leaving behind. The property consisted of 15 acres of Kentucky mountain land and an old general store that had been closed since the 1970s, a weathered building that looked like it might collapse if you leaned against it too hard, but somehow had endured 5 decades of neglect without actually falling down. Onyx was a blues musician based out of Nashville, making enough from session work and small venue gigs to pay rent, but not enough to build real security, so inheriting property felt like an unexpected gift from the universe. He drove out to Lost Creek on a Thursday in March to assess what he'd been given, entertaining vague fantasies about converting the store into a recording studio or artist retreat, something that would let him escape Nashville's expensive grind while staying connected to the music scene. The building sat at a crossroads that had once been the center of a small community, but was now just a junction of two barely maintained roads with forest pressing in from all sides, reclaiming land that had briefly been cleared for human use. The first thing Onyx noticed when he unlocked the door and stepped inside was how perfectly preserved everything appeared, as though his aunt or someone had been maintaining the interior even while letting the exterior decay. The shelves still held products, though they were covered in thick dust, brands from decades past that triggered nostalgic recognition, even though Onyx hadn't been alive when they were current. There was a counter with an old cash register, stools along what had been a small lunch counter, and racks of merchandise ranging from canned goods to work clothes to toys that looked like they belonged in a museum of American retail history. The second thing Onyx noticed, once he'd been inside for about 5 minutes, was the voices. They were faint at first, easy to dismiss as wind or imagination, but as Onyx stood still and actually listened, they became clearer, unmistakable conversations happening just below the threshold of distinct audibility. He could hear a woman discussing the price of flour, a man asking if his order had come in, children arguing about candy, all of it overlapping in the way real conversations in a busy store would overlap. But when Onyx turned to look, there was nobody there, just empty space and dust motes floating in the light coming through dirty windows. Onyx pulled out his phone and started recording audio. His musician's instinct to document interesting sounds overriding any fear or unease he felt about hearing disembodied voices. He walked through the store holding his phone up, capturing the ambient sound, and the voices continued, sometimes getting louder as he approached certain areas, conversations about prices and products and local gossip from an era that had ended before Onyx was born. He spent 2 hours there that first day, recording constantly, and when he played back the audio in his car, he discovered something that made his hands shake with a mixture of excitement and dread. The voices had been captured perfectly, clear conversations about buying supplies and weather predictions and whose daughter was getting married, and occasionally the voices would mention people by name, names that Onyx heard as contemporary to the recording, but that must have belonged to people long dead. Even more disturbing, toward the end of one recording, a male voice said clearly, "That fellow with the phone has been standing there awful long." And a female voice responded, "Maybe he's looking to buy something, we should help him." And Onyx could hear footsteps approaching his recording position, even though he'd been alone in the store. Onyx became obsessed with the store and its voices, spending the next 3 weeks driving back and forth from Nashville to Lost Creek, recording for hours at a time and documenting what he was experiencing. The voices seemed to follow a pattern, being loudest during what would have been business hours, roughly 9 to 5, and fading to almost nothing in the early mornings and late evenings. The conversations repeated sometimes, the same exchange about flour prices or the same discussion about weather, but other times they were novel, new interactions that Onyx hadn't heard before, suggesting either an enormous library of recorded exchanges or something more disturbing, that whatever was happening in the store wasn't just playback, but ongoing activity. Onyx started researching Lost Creek's history, tracking down descendants of families who'd lived there and interviewing elderly residents who remembered the store during its operational years. What he learned was that the store had been the community's hub, the place where everyone gathered not just to buy necessities, but to socialize and share news and maintain the connections that held isolated communities together. The store had closed in 1973 when the owner died and his children moved away, and Lost Creek had slowly emptied out afterward, people drifting to towns with more opportunities until only a handful of residents remained. The breakthrough came when Onyx brought recording equipment that could isolate individual voices from the overlapping conversations. Professional gear he borrowed from a friend's studio, and he was able to extract clear dialogue that made the phenomenon even stranger. The voices weren't just discussing ordinary transactions. They were talking about people who Onyx could verify through research, mentioning events that historical records confirmed had happened, providing details about Lost Creek in the 1960s and early 70s that only locals would have known. In one extended recording, Onyx captured a conversation between two men discussing the death of someone named Cassidy Wheeler in a mining accident, and Onyx's research confirmed that a Cassidy Wheeler had indeed died in 1969, in exactly the circumstances the voices described. In another recording, a woman's voice talked about her son leaving for Vietnam, and Onyx found records showing that a young man from Lost Creek named Robert Hayes had been deployed in 1968 and never returned. The voices were discussing real events, real people, real moments from a community that had existed 50 years ago, and somehow those moments were still playing out in the store where they'd originally occurred. Onyx's biggest discovery came when he left his recording equipment running overnight, wanting to capture whether the voices continued when the store should have been closed. The recording from that night was mostly silence, but around 3 in the morning, a single voice appeared, male and elderly, speaking in a monologue rather than conversation. The voice talked about closing up the store, about how it had been a good day for business, about hoping that the community would stay strong despite the mines closing and young people leaving. The voice expressed worry about the future, about what would happen to Lost Creek when the store finally had to close, about whether the connections that held people together could survive without a central gathering place. The voice identified himself as Earl Hutchins, the store's owner, and Onyx's research confirmed that Earl Hutchins had owned the store until his death in 1973, dying behind the counter of a heart attack during a normal workday, found the next morning by customers who'd come in for supplies. The nightly recording suggested that Earl was still there in some sense, still closing up shop each night, still worrying about his community, even though that community had scattered decades ago. Onyx made a decision that would change his musical career in ways he couldn't have predicted. He started sampling the voices, incorporating them into musical compositions, creating blues tracks that featured the overlapping conversations from the store as percussion and ambient texture. The effect was haunting and strangely beautiful, human voices from the past layered with guitar and harmonica, creating soundscapes that felt like time travel and grief and nostalgia all compressed into 3-minute songs. He released an album called Lost Creek Sessions that featured these compositions, and the critical response was immediate and overwhelming. Music journalists praised the innovative use of found sound, the way Onyx had created art from documentation, the emotional weight of hearing real voices from real people discussing their real lives while contemporary music played around them. The album generated enough attention that Onyx was able to quit session work and focus entirely on his own projects, and he became known for this specific approach, recording in abandoned places and incorporating the sounds he found into musical frameworks. But the more time Onyx spent at the store, the more he noticed something that the recordings hadn't fully prepared him for. The voices weren't just ambient sound, they were responding to his presence. When he worked in the store, setting up equipment, or listening to playback, the voices would sometimes comment on him, not directly, but in the way customers might discuss a stranger who'd wandered in. They'd speculate about what he was doing, wonder if he was thinking of reopening the store, express hope that maybe Lost Creek wasn't as dead as it seemed. And most disturbingly, Onyx started to appear in photographs he found in his aunt's belongings, old Polaroids from the 1970s that showed the store during its operational years, and in the background of several images, barely visible but unmistakable, was a figure that looked exactly like Onyx, standing in corners or visible through windows, watching. The photographs predated his birth by years, but there he was, or someone who looked exactly like him, present in Lost Creek decades before he should have been. Onyx consulted with paranormal researchers and physicists who specialized in temporal anomalies, trying to understand what was happening in the store and why his presence seemed to create these impossible photographs. The theories ranged from time loops to quantum entanglement, to the idea that the store existed in a space where past and present weren't properly separated, where people from different eras could occupy the same location simultaneously without necessarily being aware of each other. One researcher suggested that Onyx's repeated visits and his act of recording and sampling the voices had created a connection that worked in both directions, that he wasn't just observing the past, but becoming part of it, that his presence was being pulled backward in time and imprinted onto the store's history. The implications were terrifying and fascinating in equal measure, suggesting that time might be less linear than human consciousness perceived, that actions in the present could create effects in the past, and that the store was somehow a focal point where these temporal confusions manifested. Onyx continued working with the store's voices for 3 years, creating multiple albums and building a career that made him one of the more innovative figures in experimental blues. But he stopped visiting Lost Creek in person after finding a photograph from 1972, 1 year before the store closed, that showed Earl Hutchins ringing up a customer while in the background, clearly visible through the front window. Onyx stood on the porch, holding what looked unmistakably like a cell phone. The photograph shouldn't exist, violated every understanding of causality and time. But there it was, physical evidence that Onyx had been present in Lost Creek before he was born, and the implication that he would continue to be present there, regardless of whether his current timeline self chose to visit. He donated the store to a historical preservation society, along with all his recordings and documentation, and the society has maintained it as a museum of rural Kentucky life, though they're careful about who they allow to spend extended time there after several visitors reported experiences similar to Onyx's, hearing voices and finding themselves in photographs they shouldn't appear in. The voices continue, researchers report, and the store remains a location where time behaves strangely, where the past refuses to stay fully past, and where visitors sometimes become part of the history they came to observe. Onyx's albums remain popular, particularly among people interested in experimental music and sound art, and he continues to create work using found sounds from abandoned places, though he's careful now about spending too much time in any single location, worried about creating new temporal entanglements. The Verified Souls family has heard 13 stories tonight from Appalachia's forgotten towns, places where isolation and tragedy, and sometimes just the weight of accumulated history, have created phenomena that resist easy explanation. These stories remind us that the mountains remember everything, that abandonment doesn't equal emptiness, and that the past is always closer than we think, sometimes close enough to reach out and pull us in. If these stories have moved you, if they've made you think about the forgotten places in your own region and the histories they might hold, then subscribe to Verified Souls, hit that notification bell, and join our family as we continue exploring the darkness that hides in America's overlooked corners. Share this video with someone who appreciates real stories from real places. Drop a comment about abandoned locations near you that might have their own tales to tell. And remember that the scariest stories aren't always fiction. Sometimes they're just truth that's been waiting in the shadows for someone brave enough to listen. Until next time, horror family, stay curious, stay respectful of the places and stories we explore, and remember that every abandoned building and forgotten town holds voices that deserve to be heard, even if hearing them changes us in ways we can't predict or control.